Section 1. The joke that was never just a joke. There is a particular kind of comfort that comes with settling in for a show you have watched 100 times before. You already know what is coming. The jokes land before the punchline arrives. The characters feel like old acquaintances, like people you grew up alongside without ever having met in person. Family Guy has that quality for millions of people. It has been on television since the 31st of January 1999, premiering to roughly 22 million viewers right after Super Bowl 33. And in the decades since it first lit up living rooms across America, it has soaked into the fabric of popular culture so deeply that it is almost impossible to imagine the late-night animated landscape without it. But here is the thing about Family Guy that does not get talked about nearly enough. The show that people think they know, the one they dismiss as crude nonsense about a fat man from Rhode Island and his bizarre talking dog, is not actually the show that exists when you sit down and really look at it. Underneath every fart joke, underneath every cutaway to something absurd and unrelated, underneath every moment of chaos that the Griffin family seems to generate so naturally and so effortlessly, there is a tremendous amount of careful, deliberate, genuinely sophisticated thinking going on. Seth MacFarlane and the writers who built this show around him were doing something that the medium of animated comedy makes uniquely possible. They were telling uncomfortable truths about American life, about the class system, about faith, about loneliness, about what men actually are when nobody is watching, and they were wrapping those truths inside jokes so loud and so distracting that most people never noticed what they were actually being shown. This is a show about a blue-collar Irish Catholic man who cannot keep a thought in his head for more than 4 seconds and who causes genuine harm to the people around him almost constantly. That sounds like a description of a character you would find annoying and maybe actively dislike. And yet, Peter Griffin has been one of the most beloved characters in the history of American animation for over 25 years. That contradiction is not an accident. It is the whole point. The show knows exactly what it is doing when it makes you laugh at Peter, because what you are actually laughing at is something you recognize, something that lives in the culture you come from, something that exists in families you know and in the kind of masculinity that has been sold to working-class men in this country for generations. The scholars noticed. There is an actual academic book called Family Guy and Philosophy, A Cure for the Petarded, which is a collection of essays written by college and university professors who sat down and analyzed this cartoon in serious academic terms. It looks at the religious, political, social, economic, and philosophical ideas embedded in the show. That is not a niche or eccentric thing to do. It is simply the natural result of paying attention to what Family Guy is actually saying instead of what it appears to be saying on the surface. When Seth MacFarlane described his show to the BBC, he called it a modern vaudeville. That is an interesting word choice. Vaudeville was a form of popular theatrical entertainment that flourished in America from roughly the 1880s through the 1930s. It was broad, it was sometimes crude, it aimed at large mixed audiences and relied on a combination of physical comedy, music, and sharp satirical observation. It spoke to working people. It made them laugh at their own circumstances and at the powerful people and institutions that shaped their lives. MacFarlane saw something of that tradition in what he was building. A show that could hold your attention with the absurdity of a giant chicken fight that destroys half a city, while simultaneously making you feel something real about the way working-class men cope with lives that feel too small for what they imagined they would become. The humor in Family Guy, particularly in those early seasons before certain creative choices began pulling it in different directions, worked on multiple levels simultaneously. A joke would land on the surface as pure absurdity, a cutaway gag about something completely random and disconnected from reality. But sitting right beneath that surface was usually something that pointed at a genuine truth about American culture, American politics, American religion, or American family life. The joke about Peter doing something idiotic at work was also a joke about the dehumanizing nature of assembly line labor. The joke about Lois trying to maintain patience while her husband made everything harder was also a commentary on what the institution of marriage does to women who give up their own ambitions to maintain a household. The joke about Stewie's ridiculous British accent and his elaborate plans for world domination was also a meditation on what it feels like to be a child trapped in a world you did not choose and cannot control. All of this was running quietly, steadily, underneath every single episode. And the beauty of hiding serious ideas inside broad comedy is that the comedy makes the medicine go down. People who might have switched off a documentary about class resentment in America would happily sit through 40 minutes of Peter Griffin making catastrophically bad decisions, never quite realizing that what they were watching was essentially that documentary, just wrapped in a yellow shirt and a pair of green trousers. Over the next several hours, we are going to go deep into all of it. We are going to move slowly and carefully through every major character, every major theme, every layer of meaning that this show placed inside its jokes over the course of its long and complicated run. There will be moments where what we uncover feels surprisingly heavy for a cartoon. There will be moments where a joke you have always found funny suddenly looks entirely different once you understand what it was pointing at. And there will be moments where the show reveals itself to have been genuinely empathetic, genuinely thoughtful, and genuinely brave, in ways that its surface-level reputation does not even begin to suggest. So get comfortable, let the voices settle into a rhythm, and let the show that you thought you already knew show you everything it was keeping just beneath the surface. Drop a comment and let me know what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you are watching from. And if you want more long-form content like this, a subscription means more than you probably realize. Section 2. Peter Griffin and the blue-collar American dream that never arrived. Peter Griffin is, on the surface, a buffoon. He is overweight. He is not very intelligent. His IQ was formally tested in the Season 4 episode titled Petarded, and the result placed it at around 70, which is the threshold at which intellectual disability is typically diagnosed. He works at a brewery. He drinks too much. He makes decisions that range from poor to genuinely catastrophic, with a speed that suggests he does not even pause to consider consequences before acting. He is in most visible respects the kind of man that our culture loves to mock and rarely takes seriously. But here is what the show understood from the very beginning and communicated through almost every episode it produced in its earlier, sharper seasons. Peter Griffin is not a joke. He is the punchline of a joke, which is a very different thing. The joke itself is about what America does to men like him. Peter is explicitly coded as a working-class Irish-American Catholic from New England. He was born to a religious household with a strict stepfather named Francis Griffin, who embodied all the rigidity and moral weight that traditional Catholic working-class masculinity carries in that part of the world. Peter did not go to college. He got a job at a toy factory, then moved to a brewery, and settled into a life structured around the rhythms of work, beer, friendship, and family. He married a woman, Lois, who came from genuine old money, whose family, the Pewterschmidts, represents the kind of wealth that Peter will never come close to, and whose father, Carter, has barely concealed contempt for the son-in-law he was never going to approve of. That class tension is baked into the DNA of the show, and it is never just background detail. It explains almost everything about how Peter behaves. The recklessness, the impulsiveness, the way he pursues absurd short-term pleasures with total disregard for long-term consequence. These are not simply the traits of a stupid man. They are the coping mechanisms of a man who has figured out, at some level he cannot quite articulate, that the future being offered to him is not particularly exciting, and that the best available response is to extract as much immediate pleasure from the present as possible before the grayness of the routine swallows him entirely. One academic analysis framed this beautifully by pointing out that the distress Peter causes his family is predicated on a set of outdated standards that governed previous generations of American suburban life. Peter behaves as though it is still the 1950s or 1960s, an era when the economic responsibility for class status rested entirely with the father, while the mother was defined entirely by her role in the home. He operates by those rules even though they have long since become obsolete, and the comedy of his situation comes precisely from the collision between those old expectations and the reality of a world that has moved on without him. There is a reading of Peter Griffin that sees him as a kind of tragic figure. He is a man who was sold a particular idea of what his life was supposed to look like, an idea built around masculine authority in the household, around the dignity of honest labor, around the social stability of the bar with your friends, and the game on television, and the wife who manages the home while you manage the world beyond it. None of those promises turned out to be entirely true. The labor is not particularly dignified. The authority in the household is constantly undermined by his own inadequacy. The wife manages everything, including him. The bar is real, but it is also a refuge from a life that never quite delivered what was advertised. The giant chicken fights are perhaps the clearest expression of this in the entire show. Ernie the giant chicken, first introduced in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, is a recurring antagonist who periodically appears and engages Peter in extended, city-destroying brawls. The trigger for the original fight was a coupon that had expired. Peter and the chicken came to blows over something as petty and small as an expired promotional offer, and the fight escalated into an event that caused massive collateral damage across entire city blocks. This is, on the surface, pure absurdist comedy. It is one of the most visually spectacular recurring gags the show ever produced. But consider what the chicken fight is actually about. It is about the way working-class men can become consumed by grievances that are wildly out of proportion to their actual significance. The expired coupon is a proxy for every slight, every disappointment, every moment where the world failed to honor a deal it had implicitly made. Peter cannot fight the brewery that pays him badly. He cannot fight the class system that keeps him below his wife's family no matter what he does. He cannot fight the slow erasure of the particular kind of masculine identity he was raised to inhabit, but he can fight a chicken. And he will fight that chicken with everything he has, because the chicken is something tangible, something present, something that can actually be punched. This is not a subtle metaphor, but that is precisely the point. The show is taking something real and exaggerating it to the point of comedy, which is exactly how satire works. Peter's entire character arc, across the seasons where he was written with genuine care and intelligence, is the arc of a man performing a kind of masculinity that no longer quite makes sense in the world he inhabits, and suffering real consequences for the gap between what he believes he is supposed to be and what he actually is. The relationship between Peter and his father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt, captures this class dynamic with particular sharpness. Carter is old money. He is a multi-millionaire who is voiced by MacFarlane himself, and who represents the kind of wealth that builds itself into institutions and regards people like Peter with barely concealed contempt. Carter's occasional anti-Semitism and general disdain for everyone below his economic station are played for laughs, but they are recognizable as portraits of actual attitudes that exist in real wealthy families. The humor comes from the exaggeration, but the root is genuine. What makes the Peter and Carter dynamic so interesting is that Peter is not intimidated by Carter in the way you might expect. He lacks the social intelligence to fully register how much Carter looks down on him. He engages with his father-in-law as though they are roughly equivalent people, which in a class-stratified society is itself a kind of radical act. There is something almost liberating about a man who is too unself-conscious to perform the deference that wealth has learned to expect. Peter does not know he is supposed to feel inferior, and so he simply does not, which drives Carter to a constant low simmer of frustration. This is the show making a point about class and self-perception. The working-class man who does not internalize the hierarchy is, in his own way, resisting it. Not cleverly, not strategically, just through the sheer blunt force of his social obliviousness. Peter is not a radical. He is not making a statement. He simply lacks the programming that teaches people to know their place, and in the absence of that programming, he walks through walls that other people stop at. His friendship group at the Drunken Clam reinforces this portrait of working-class American masculinity with genuine affection and specificity. Peter, Joe Swanson, Cleveland Brown, and Glenn Quagmire represent a particular kind of male friendship, the kind that forms around proximity and shared routine rather than deep emotional intimacy, and that sustains itself through the shared ritual of being in the same place at the same time with cold drinks and something to watch or talk about. These are men who love each other in the particular way that men who were raised never to say so actually demonstrate that love, through showing up, through small loyalties, through being present in the uncomplicated physical sense. The early seasons handled this group with a warmth that gradually eroded as the show went on. But in the beginning, there was something genuinely true in those bar scenes. Peter's relationships with his friends were portrayed as authentic and nourishing in the understated way that male friendships actually are for a lot of men. The humor came from the specificity of the rituals, the conversations they had, the way they navigated each other's limitations without making it explicit. It was observation, not mockery. Peter's relationship with Lois in those early seasons similarly contained layers of genuine insight beneath the comedy. They were a couple from different worlds who had made a life together, and the show understood that such a life is built on constant negotiation, on tolerance, on love that has to survive the daily friction of two people who are fundamentally not the same. Peter did things that drove Lois to the edge of her patience regularly. But the early version of the show always found its way back to the core affection between them, to the moment where Peter, in his clumsy and insufficient way, acknowledged that she was the thing worth coming home to. That is what the early Peter was. A man with enormous flaws, enormous blind spots, enormous capacity for inadvertent harm, but also a genuine love for the people in his life that existed below all of it. The comedy of his character was always in tension with that love, and the tension is what made him human. When the show later stripped away the love and left only the chaos, it did not just make Peter less likable, it made him less true. Because the truth the character was built to tell was never really about his stupidity. It was about the gap between what working-class American men are given to work with and what life actually asks of them. There is something almost Shakespearean about that gap, in the sense that Shakespeare was always interested in what happens when ordinary people are placed in situations that exceed their capacity to cope. Peter Griffin is not Hamlet. He is emphatically not. But the fundamental question the show was asking through him in those first several seasons, what happens to a man who is shaped by one world and must live in a different one, is a question worth asking. And the comedy, the real comedy, the kind that makes you laugh and then feel something after the laughter fades, was always the show's answer to that question. He was never just a fat man from Rhode Island. He was the dream that was sold to a generation of working-class men, and the comedy was the gap between what the dream promised and what the dream actually delivered. Every stumble, every explosion, every fight with a giant chicken was that gap made visible. Section 3. Brian Griffin and the Intellectual Fraud Complex. Brian Griffin is the family dog. He walks upright, he speaks English, he drinks martinis, he drives a car, and he has spent the better part of the show's run trying desperately to be taken seriously as a writer and an intellectual. He is the character who was designed to serve as the audience's point of identification, the reasonable one, the one who rolls his eyes at the chaos around him and occasionally tries to inject some sanity into the proceedings. He is also one of the most psychologically honest portraits of a particular human type that animated television has ever produced. And the truth it tells about him is not always flattering. In the early seasons, Brian worked because he was genuinely the grounded one. His role as the voice of reason was earned. He had read the books he referenced. He had the kind of witty, dry awareness that made his observations feel sharp rather than performative. His friendship with Peter was convincing because it was built on a genuine complementary dynamic, Brian's clarity cutting through Peter's fog with affection rather than condescension. He was flawed in interesting ways, the failed novel, the barely contained romantic feelings for Lois, the drinking that was a little too present to ignore entirely. These were the flaws of a real person, not a cartoon. But here is what the early Brian was actually saying about a certain kind of person, and this is the layer that gets overlooked when people discuss the character. Brian was a dog who had been educated into the human world and who perpetually occupied that uncomfortable middle space between belonging and not belonging. He was smart enough to see the dysfunction of the household he lived in, but not independent enough to actually leave it. He had ambitions that consistently exceeded his accomplishments. He wanted to be a writer and could not finish a novel. He wanted romantic relationships with human women and found them consistently unsatisfying. He presented himself as intellectually superior to the people around him but was functionally dependent on a family that treated him, for all his sophistication, as a pet. This is a portrait of a specific kind of frustrated intellectual, the person who is smart enough to want more than the life they are living, but not actually capable enough to achieve the version of themselves they have imagined. The tragedy of early Brian is not that he is a dog. The tragedy is that his dog nature, his actual physical existence as a dependent animal in someone else's house, is a perfect metaphor for the position of the educated but underachieving person in a world that rewards ambition with opportunity but does not guarantee the talent to back the ambition up. There is a scene in the Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, widely considered one of the best single episodes the show ever produced, where Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault overnight. The episode has no cutaways, no random gags. It is just two characters talking with unusual honesty. And Brian reveals to Stewie that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has thought about ending his own life. He is not suicidal in the immediate sense, but the thought has been there. The possibility has been given a physical form, a loaded weapon in a drawer, waiting. That is not a comedy beat. That is a window into genuine psychological darkness that the show was willing to open only briefly before closing it again. But it opens it, and what it reveals is a character who, behind all the wit and the martinis and the intellectual posturing, is genuinely unhappy in a way that the surface personality works very hard to conceal. That is the Brian the early show understood. A man-shaped dog or a dog-shaped man, depending on how you look at it, whose sophistication was partly armor and partly performance, and partly the only available alternative to acknowledging how much was missing. The political soapboxing that came to dominate Brian's characterization in the later seasons was not without a kernel of genuine insight in those early forms. Brian was liberal, atheist, environmentally conscious. He had views. The show was not wrong to give him views. But there is a meaningful difference between a character who has political opinions and a character who exists to deliver political opinions. And as the seasons progressed, Brian moved firmly from the first category to the second. The problem was not the views themselves. The problem was what happens to any character when their purpose narrows from being a full person to being a vehicle for a position. They stop being real and start being a mouthpiece. And a mouthpiece, however right it may be about the things it says, is not someone you care about. The episode Brian writes a bestseller from season 9 crystallized what the character had become by that point. Stewie encourages Brian to write something, and Brian produces a self-help book that becomes enormously successful. Rather than responding with gratitude, Brian becomes a monster. He treats Stewie, who had believed in him and prompted the whole endeavor, with open contempt and arrogance. He mistakes commercial success for intellectual validation and behaves accordingly, as though the bestseller list had retroactively confirmed everything he had always believed about his own superiority. This is, in its way, a sharp observation about what external validation does to people who have been seeking it for too long. Someone who has spent years feeling undervalued and overlooked does not always respond to sudden recognition with humility. Often they respond by overcorrecting dramatically in the direction of the arrogance they had been suppressing, by becoming the insufferable version of the person they always privately suspected they were. The episode was making a real psychological point. The problem was that after making it, the show kept Brian in that state, which turned a moment of insight into a permanent character trait, and the permanent trait into a dead end. The speech that Glenn Quagmire delivers in the Season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, where he comprehensively dismantles Brian's self-image in front of everyone, is famous for a reason. Quagmire calls out Brian for being a fraud who pretends to intellectualism he does not actually possess. He calls him out for his failed writing career and his pretentious attitude. He calls him out for being a bad father who abandoned his own child. He calls him out for his hypocrisy across the board. And everything Quagmire says is accurate. The show itself, in the very act of writing that speech, acknowledged that Brian had become everything a real intellectual is not, which means the show was aware of what it had done to the character even as it kept doing it. What is fascinating about that Quagmire speech, and this is where the hidden truth inside the joke lives, is that the most incisive critique of the pretentious pseudo-intellectual is being delivered by the character who is the show's most explicit embodiment of predatory male sexuality. Quagmire is in many ways a terrible person. He is promiscuous in ways that frequently cross lines. He is selfish and frequently amoral. But he is honest about what he is. He does not dress his appetites up in the language of sophistication. He does not claim moral superiority while behaving badly. He is what he is, openly and without apology, which in the show's moral universe gives him a kind of integrity that Brian, who claims to be better than everyone while behaving as poorly as anyone, does not possess. The show is saying something interesting there about the difference between open vice and hypocritical virtue. Quagmire is objectively worse in terms of his behavior toward women, but Brian claims to be better and is not, which is somehow more contemptible. The show placed these two characters in opposition to illuminate something real about the relationship between stated values and actual behavior, about the gap between the self we perform for others and the self we actually are. Brian's death in the season 12 episode, Life of Brian, which aired in November of 2013 and generated national media attention and a petition signed by tens of thousands of people demanding his return, is worth pausing on even briefly. The fan response was extraordinary in a way that told its own story. People were genuinely distraught. They signed petitions, they got memorial tattoos, they flooded social media with expressions of grief that looked almost identical to expressions of grief for real losses. What that response told the show's creators, and what it tells us, is that however insufferable Brian had become in the later seasons, the original version of the character still lived in people's memories so vividly that his absence felt like a real loss. The character that had been built and then gradually dismantled over a decade left behind enough of an impression that when he was gone, even temporarily, people felt it. That is the measure of what a well-constructed character can do. It creates a real attachment in people's interior lives. It becomes, in some sense, a person they know, and the grief that follows its disappearance, however absurd the grieving person might find themselves feeling for a cartoon dog, is genuine. Seth MacFarlane himself said that Brian's death was intended to serve as a warm holiday lesson about cherishing the people you love before they are gone. That is a simple, sincere, and rather moving idea, which tells you that underneath all the years of diminishing the character, there was still an awareness of what Brian had meant at his best, what the character had pointed at in his finest moments. The dog who was almost a person, the intellectual who was almost an intellectual, the friend who was almost perfect in the way friends never actually are. Section 4. Stewie Griffin, and what his evil actually was. Before we go further, we should establish something clearly. Stewie Griffin is a 1-year-old baby. He has the body and the physical needs of an infant. He still drinks from a bottle. He still wears diapers. His mother still feeds him strained peas and fruit puree from small plastic jars. He cannot reliably use a toilet or reach a light switch without assistance. He also speaks in an upper-class British accent that Seth MacFarlane, based on Rex Harrison's performance in My Fair Lady. He has built fighter jets, time machines, weather control devices, mind control apparatus, teleportation systems, and an assortment of weapons that would not be out of place in a Bond villain's lair. His primary goal throughout the first 3 seasons of the show was to kill his mother and take over the world. Not in that order necessarily, though the two objectives were often intertwined. The comedy of Stewie in those early seasons is obvious and immediate. The contrast between infant and supervillain is intrinsically funny. A baby building a laser gun in his crib while humming to himself about world domination is funny on its face, in the way that unexpected juxtapositions are always funny. But if you sit with the character for a while, particularly if you sit with him through the lens of what MacFarlane said he was designed to represent, something else comes into focus. MacFarlane describes Stewie as being created to represent the general helplessness of an infant through the eyes of an adult. That is the key. Stewie is not just a baby who happens to be a supervillain. He is a projection of what infant helplessness actually feels like from the inside. Infants cannot control anything. They cannot speak in ways adults can understand. They cannot move through the world independently. They are entirely at the mercy of the people around them. Their hunger, their pain, their discomfort, their desire for contact or stimulation, none of it is within their own power to address. They depend absolutely on the will of the large, powerful, fundamentally alien beings who have custody of their existence. Now imagine experiencing that condition with the cognitive sophistication of an adult. Imagine understanding fully what is being done to you, understanding that you have been brought into a world without your consent, that you are housed in a body that cannot yet execute your will, that the woman who feeds you and changes your diapers and sings songs to you in a voice designed to calm an animal is, from your perspective, a captor who controls every aspect of your existence. Imagine how that would feel. Imagine what you might want to do about it if you had the intelligence to formulate a plan. Stewie's hatred of Lois when seen through this lens is not really about Lois as a person. It is about what Lois represents. She is the embodiment of the dependency he cannot escape. She is the source of his helplessness. Every attempt to kill her is an attempt to break free from the condition of absolute dependence that infanthood imposes. His plans for world domination are not really about wanting power for its own sake. They are about wanting the opposite of what he currently has. The infant who can control nothing fantasizes about controlling everything. That is not madness. That is a perfectly logical response to his situation. There is also a reading of Stewie's relationship with his teddy bear Rupert that rewards attention. Rupert is a stuffed toy that Stewie treats as his confidant, his best friend, and in the early seasons, the only reliable relationship in his life. Rupert does not judge. Rupert does not have his own needs that override Stewie's. Rupert is always available and always attentive. The warmth that Stewie shows toward this inanimate object is in direct contrast to the coldness and hostility he projects toward his human family. He reserves his genuine affection for something that cannot betray or abandon him. This is, in emotional terms, the behavior of a child who does not feel safe attaching to the people around him. The fantasy of Rupert as a real companion, a being who listens and understands without complication, speaks to a loneliness that the comedy consistently papers over. Stewie is surrounded by family. He is not isolated in the physical sense, but he exists inside this elaborate interior world of genius and scheming precisely because the exterior world, the one populated by his family members who cannot hear him, does not seem to have room for who he actually is. The character arc that took Stewie from evil genius baby to softer, more emotionally expressive personality after the show returned from cancellation was not without its own logic. The show's creators felt that the original concept had been taken as far as they could take it. That may have been true, but what the transition from evil Stewie to emotional Stewie lost, beyond the obvious comedic originality, was the particular kind of truth the character was telling. The evil genius baby was a precise and pointed metaphor for the experience of infancy, for the rage and the helplessness and the determination to master a world that currently masters you. The softer Stewie who emerged is entertaining in his own ways, but he is no longer a metaphor for anything so specific and so true. His friendship with Brian, which became the emotional center of the show for many seasons after the character transition, did produce some genuinely moving moments. The episode Christmas Guy, in which Stewie uses time travel to save Brian after his death, is widely considered one of the most emotionally effective episodes in the show's later run. Stewie's grief at Brian's loss, the way he channels his considerable intelligence and resources toward a singular goal motivated entirely by love, is the character at his most fully human. That episode proved that the writers could still produce real emotional resonance when they committed to it, but it also illustrated something about what the character had lost. The original Stewie produced his most electric moments through his coldness, his calculation, his refusal to be sentimentalized. He was frightening in the way genuinely uncompromising intelligence is frightening. The later Stewie produces his best moments through his warmth, his vulnerability, his willingness to let his love for Brian override his characteristic detachment. These are both valid versions of the character, but only one of them was saying something that had never been said quite that way before. There is a minor episode moment that deserves mention here because it captures something important about Stewie's psychology that tends to get passed over. In an episode where Stewie visits a child psychologist at his preschool, the therapist manages to break through Stewie's elaborate defenses and reach the genuine person underneath. What is revealed, briefly, is a profoundly insecure little boy who has constructed the entire persona of the evil genius. The British accent, the elaborate weaponry, the detached superiority, as protection against the fear of being ordinary, of being, as he puts it, unremarkable and average. The armor is the villainy. The coldness is the shield. What it protects is something very small and very scared of not mattering. Stewie allows the therapist to die of a heart attack rather than permit anyone else to know what was revealed in that session. It is the darkest thing the character does in the entire run, and it lands so quietly that it is easy to miss what just happened. He chose his image over a human life. He chose to protect the performance of who he is over acknowledging who he actually is. And he cannot sleep that night because the choice was terrible, and the part of him that is still just a child in a diaper knows it. That is the show doing something real. That is the kind of moment that does not exist in comedy for its own sake. It exists because the writers understood something about how people construct identities out of the things they are afraid of being seen without. Stewie's entire persona is a defense mechanism. And the tragedy of the character across all the seasons and all the evolution is that the defense mechanism is so successful that almost nobody, in or out of the show, ever quite gets through it. Section 5. The Quagmire Paradox and the Moral Compass of the Least Likely Man. Glenn Quagmire is, by almost any measurable standard, the most morally problematic character in the main cast of Family Guy. His behavior toward women over the course of the show's run ranges from deeply inappropriate to genuinely criminal. His relationship to consent is, in the early seasons especially, presented as comedy in a way that has not aged well and would not be written the same way today. He is, in the language of the show's own mythology, a predator. And yet Quagmire is also, with some regularity, the moral compass of the group. The character who sees through pretense. The character who calls out hypocrisy. The character who, when pushed, demonstrates a capacity for genuine loyalty and genuine love that the more apparently sophisticated characters around him conspicuously lack. The famous speech he delivers about Brian is not an isolated moment of accidental clarity. It is part of a consistent pattern in which the character who is the most openly disreputable member of the group is also the one most capable of honest assessment. This is a paradox, and Family Guy puts it on the screen deliberately. The show is interested in the question of whether honesty about your vices is morally preferable to dishonesty about your virtues. Quagmire does terrible things. He also admits that he does terrible things, or, at minimum, does not pretend to be something he is not. He is self-aware about his nature in a way that most of the other characters are not self-aware about theirs. Compare this to Brian, who claims to be morally superior to almost everyone around him and behaves, when you actually catalog his actions, as badly as Quagmire in many respects and worse in some. Brian abandons a child. Brian lets a woman drown because she has a child, which means she is probably married, which means she is not available to him. Brian treats his best friend with contempt when he achieves success. Quagmire does terrible things, but at least his terrible things are legible as terrible. Brian's terrible things are dressed in the language of enlightenment, and the show identifies that as more corrupting. This is a real observation about how certain kinds of people operate in the world. There is a type of person who has learned to perform virtue so effectively that they themselves have lost track of the gap between the performance and the reality. They believe themselves to be the person they present, even when their actual behavior contradicts that self-image at every turn. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this kind of self-deception is considerable, and it produces a particular kind of cruelty because the person who believes themselves to be good cannot acknowledge the harm they cause. To acknowledge the harm would be to acknowledge the gap between who they are and who they believe themselves to be, and that gap is unbearable. Quagmire does not have this problem. He knows what he is. He has apparently made a kind of peace with it, or at least a kind of truce. This does not make him good. His behavior toward women is not redeemed by his self-awareness. But it does make him, in the particular moral framework that Family Guy built, a kind of honest broker. When he delivers a verdict, it comes from someone who has no investment in maintaining a flattering self-image. He is not protecting a reputation. He is just telling you what he sees. There are episodes that peel back the surface of Quagmire's character to reveal something unexpected underneath. His relationship with his sister Brenda, who is in an abusive relationship, is one of the most emotionally serious storylines the show produced in its middle-run seasons. When Quagmire discovers that Brenda's boyfriend is physically abusing her and that Brenda is making excuses for it, he is genuinely devastated, not in a performative way. In the way of someone who actually loves the person being hurt and cannot understand why she will not let herself be helped. The episode's handling of this material was controversial because it went in a direction that many viewers found uncomfortable, but the show's willingness to engage with domestic abuse as something that happens to real families, including the families of people we might not expect to have the emotional complexity required to respond to it with love and grief, was a form of honesty. Quagmire's response to his sister's situation revealed something about his character that his sexual behavior did not. It revealed that his incapacity for healthy romantic relationships does not mean his capacity for love itself is absent. He loves his sister. He is genuinely afraid for her. He is willing to act on that fear in ways that put him at risk. The show was making a point about how human beings are not consistent moral agents. The same person can be predatory in one context and fiercely protective in another. The same character can be your worst nightmare in a bar and your most reliable defender in a crisis. This is not relativism. The bad behavior is still bad. But the good is also real, and refusing to acknowledge either the complexity or the contradiction is a form of dishonesty that the show, at its best, consistently refused. Quagmire's relationship to love and loneliness is worth considering for a moment. He pursues women with the relentlessness of someone who is, at the root of it, desperately lonely. His promiscuity is not really about pleasure. It is about contact, about the brief alleviation of a particular kind of emptiness that his lifestyle systematically perpetuates. He is someone who has developed a behavior pattern that reliably prevents him from getting what he actually needs, which is genuine, sustained intimacy, and who therefore pursues what he can get, which is encounter without commitment, warmth without weight. This is a recognizable human pattern. The person who is afraid of depth and therefore pursues surfaces, who collects experiences because they cannot quite manage the sustained vulnerability that genuine connection requires. Quagmire's inability to find or sustain a meaningful relationship with a woman is not incidental to his character. It is the engine of the character. The comedy is the coping mechanism. The relentlessness of the pursuit is the symptom of the underlying loss. The show did not always handle this with great sophistication. In later seasons, Quagmire's behavior escalated in ways that moved beyond satire into something less comfortable. But the foundation was real. The character was built around a genuine human truth about the relationship between loneliness and the behaviors we develop to keep from having to sit with that loneliness. And the truth gave the character a gravity beneath the gags that explained why, despite everything, people kept finding him sympathetic in ways they could not quite justify. Section 6. Meg Griffin and what the show understood about invisibility. Meg Griffin is 17 years old. She goes to James Woods Regional High School. She is not conventionally popular. She wears a pink knit hat and glasses. She wants, with a desperation that is the most relatable thing about her, to be liked, to belong, to be seen as worthy of something other than indifference or contempt from the people around her. In the first 3 seasons of the show, Meg was the least dramatic member of an extremely dramatic family. The joke about her was that she was ordinary. In a household containing a man-baby, a talking dog with literary pretensions, and an infant supervillain, being simply a teenage girl with normal insecurities was itself a form of comedy. She was the straight person in a room full of chaos, and her normalcy, her desire to be unremarkable in the ways that most people are unremarkable, read as sweetly absurd by contrast with everything around her. The trajectory from that starting point to the Meg of the middle seasons is one of the most genuinely unsettling character arcs in the history of American animated television. And what makes it unsettling is not the extent of the cruelty directed at her, though that cruelty did become extensive and extreme by any reasonable measure. What makes it unsettling is the way the cruelty was framed. Let us be precise about what the show did to Meg. Starting around season 4 and escalating sharply through seasons 8 through 14, Meg became the receptacle for the family's collective dysfunction. Every negative emotion that the other characters needed to discharge somewhere got discharged at Meg. Peter's contempt for weakness, Lois's suppressed resentment of the domestic role she accepted, Chris's need to feel superior to at least one person, Stewie's casual cruelty, Brian's occasional willingness to participate in group dismissals of her. All of it landed on Meg because Meg was there, and because the show had decided that Meg's function was to absorb the impact. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10 is the moment that brings all of this into the sharpest focus. The Griffin family is trapped indoors during a hurricane. Meg, after seasons of accumulated humiliation, snaps. She confronts each family member in turn with a precise and accurate account of how they have treated her and why it has been wrong. It is a speech that the audience has been waiting for across years of increasingly cruel treatment, and when it comes, it lands with genuine emotional force. This is the moment. This is Meg refusing the role that has been imposed on her. This is the character asserting her own worth against the narrative that has tried to strip it from her. Then, the episode ends, and Meg goes to Brian and voluntarily takes it all back. She tells him that she understands now that her role in the family is to be the one everyone takes their frustrations out on, that she serves as a pressure valve, and that without her in that role, the family falls apart. And so she agrees to go back, to absorb, to endure. For the family's sake, the message being communicated in that ending is devastating when you actually listen to it. The show was telling the audience, at some level of intention that may or may not have been fully conscious, that victims of systematic abuse should accept their role because their suffering performs a necessary social function. That standing up for yourself is selfish, because it forces the people who have been hurting you to confront themselves. That the correct response to years of mistreatment is to return to the position of accepting it because the alternative disrupts everyone else's comfort. This is not an abstract concern. This is a message that real people in real situations of abuse hear regularly. You need to understand why they do it. You need to keep the peace. You need to think about what you are doing to the family. The show, in that episode, dramatized one of the most common and most damaging things that victims of family-level abuse are told, and it framed it not as a horror, but as a touching moment of self-sacrifice. Now, there is a counter-argument here that the show's defenders have made, and it deserves acknowledgement. The argument is that the show was being deliberately absurdist, that the Meg storyline was always a satirical exaggeration of how unpopular teenagers are treated by their peer groups and even their own families, and that the absurdism was the point. That the show was holding up a mirror to genuine dynamics and making them visible through comic exaggeration. There is some truth in that reading. The show clearly knew what it was doing, because it occasionally demonstrated an ability to write Meg with real compassion and depth. In the Simpsons crossover episode, in the Peter's sister episode, in isolated moments scattered through the later seasons, where she was given the chance to be a full person. Those moments proved that the writers understood who Meg was and what she deserved. They proved that the capacity was there to treat her well. That makes the sustained cruelty of the middle seasons feel more, not less, deliberate. This was not accidental neglect. This was a choice. The show chose to make Meg's suffering a running gag, then occasionally acknowledged that the suffering was real and the character deserved better, then went right back to the gag. The episodes where Meg is treated well stand out precisely because they are exceptions, because the baseline they depart from and return to is so relentlessly bleak. What is true and worth sitting with is that Meg, through all of it, remained one of the most sympathetic characters on the show, precisely because what she wanted, to be loved by her family, to be accepted by her peers, to feel that her existence had value, was so simply and universally human. She wanted the things that every person wants. The show punished her for wanting them and made a comedy out of the punishment. But it could not entirely erase the legitimacy of the wanting. And in that gap, in the space between what she deserved and what she got, the show told a truth about invisibility that a lot of people who have felt invisible in their own lives recognized on some level they could not quite articulate. Mila Kunis, the actress who has voiced Meg since season 2, has spoken about experiencing the character's treatment in reality, with people approaching her to deliver Peter's dismissive line about Meg as though it were a greeting. The fictional cruelty bled into the real world and attached itself to the actual woman behind the voice. That is a strange and uncomfortable thing to sit with. The way a character's position in a fictional hierarchy can reach out and touch the person who gives it a voice. It says something about how deeply the show's dynamics embedded themselves in the culture, and something about the real-world cost of treating certain kinds of people as though their feelings are a comedic resource to be mined. Section 7. The cutaway as a cultural mirror. One of the things that gets said about Family Guy's cutaway gags most frequently, usually by critics, is that they are random. That they have no connection to anything. That they are the product of a room full of writers randomly combining unrelated ideas until something funny results. The manatee and the idea ball, as South Park's famous parody suggested. This criticism has some merit as a description of the later seasons, where the cutaways did become increasingly disconnected and increasingly used as time-filling devices rather than comedic enhancements. But it badly misses what the cutaways were doing in the show's earlier, more intentional incarnation. Those cutaways were not random. They were a specific type of cultural sampling, a comedy technique that worked by drawing on the enormous shared repository of American cultural memory and finding unexpected angles on it. The early cutaways operated on a principle of recognition. A character would make a reference, and the show would immediately illustrate that reference in a way that amplified or subverted the original point. The comedy was almost always dependent on the audience knowing the source material well enough to feel the gap between the original and the Family Guy version. This is what McFarlane meant when he described the show as rooted in presupposition, in the shared cultural knowledge that the audience brings with it, and that the jokes require in order to function. This technique made Family Guy, in a way that its imitators rarely managed to replicate, a genuine cultural document of the America it was made in. The specific things it referenced, the way it referenced them, the angles it found on them, all of this constituted a running commentary on what American pop culture had accumulated in the decades prior to the show's creation, and on how that accumulated material shaped and reflected the people who consumed it. Take the recurring references to the 1970s and 1980s. Peter Griffin is, in generational terms, a product of those decades. He was raised on their television, their movies, their music, their particular vision of what American life was supposed to look like. The show's cutaways frequently plunged back into that material, and the comedy was consistently in the gap between how the 70s and 80s understood themselves and how they look from the outside. The era's self-image was relentlessly optimistic, energetic, forward-looking. The retrospective view is considerably more complicated, more aware of the dysfunction, the inequality, the particular ways in which that era's cultural products were saturated with assumptions about gender, race, and class that the present can no longer pretend are innocent. Peter's nostalgia for that era is not portrayed as simply funny. It is portrayed as a symptom. He idealizes a past that was never quite as good as he remembers it, particularly for people who were not white male breadwinners in suburban America. His longing for those good old-fashioned values that the theme song asks about is a longing for a world that served people like Peter at the expense of everyone who was not like Peter, and the show understood this even as it portrayed Peter's nostalgia with genuine affection for its emotional reality. The show's pop culture references were also, in their early form, doing something specific about the relationship between the American media landscape and the people it creates. Family Guy characters are saturated with media in a way that mirrors how American consumers actually live. Peter is not just someone who watches television. He is someone whose entire interior world has been partly built by television, whose references and frameworks and emotional responses are all filtered through the enormous quantity of cultural product he has consumed. The cutaways are, in this sense, a representation of how his mind actually works. He does not just think about things. He thinks about things in relation to shows he has seen and movies he has watched and commercials he has absorbed. His consciousness is, like the consciousness of so many people in the media-saturated modern world, partly colonized by content he did not choose to encounter. The Conway Twitty gag, the recurring bit where the show replaced a joke with a full-length country music performance and offered nothing beyond the performance itself, is the most frequently cited example of the cutaway at its most purely time-wasting. But there is a reading of the Conway Twitty bit, if you are generous with it, that interprets it as a joke about a very specific segment of Peter's cultural archive, the world of classic country music that represents a kind of Americana that the rest of the show's cultural references tend to overlook. Peter's references tended to skew toward mainstream commercial American entertainment. The Conway Twitty bit plunged into a genuinely different cultural register, into the world of working-class country music with its direct emotional vocabulary and its association with rural and Southern American identity. The joke, if it was a joke, was about the existence of that register and its strangeness from the perspective of the show's primary cultural frame of reference. Whether or not that reading is too charitable to a gag that was almost certainly produced by writers who had run out of ideas for a specific episode, it illustrates something true about the way the cutaway format functioned at its best. It could be used to pull in material from almost anywhere in the cultural landscape and place it alongside whatever was happening in the main story. The juxtapositions it created were sometimes just silly, but they were also capable of being genuinely revealing. The gap between what a character expected and what appeared in the cutaway could illuminate something about the character's assumptions, about the limits of their perspective, about the arbitrariness of cultural hierarchies that treated some things as worthy of reference and others as beneath notice. The South Park parody that accused Family Guy of having its jokes written by manatees was funny and contained enough truth to sting. But it also, in its contemptuous dismissal of the show's technique, missed the degree to which a genuinely clever use of cultural sampling is its own creative skill. Finding the specific reference that illuminates a specific moment. Understanding which gap between an audience's expectations and a cutaway's content will produce the particular kind of surprise that translates into laughter. This is not nothing. In the early seasons, when the technique was being applied with genuine intelligence and discipline, it was a form of comic craft that was more sophisticated than it looked. The deterioration of the cutaway into pure time-filling was real and damaging. But the deterioration should not be used to retroactively dismiss what the technique was actually capable of when it was practiced with care. The early cutaways were a form of compressed cultural criticism, fast and funny and startlingly pointed when they were working, and the best of them have earned their place in the archive of American satirical comedy. Section 8. Religion, Politics, and the Sacred Cows. Family Guy quietly slaughtered. Family Guy has always had a complicated relationship with religion, which is to say it has had approximately the relationship with religion that a liberal arts-educated person in coastal America tends to have. It is skeptical of institutional religion. It is particularly suspicious of the kind of religious conservatism that uses faith as a cudgel for social control. It has an atheist character in Brian who regularly articulates a secular worldview, and it has made some of the most explicitly irreverent and sacrilegious jokes in the history of network television. The show's portrayal of God is worth examining carefully because it tells you a great deal about what it was actually doing with religious material. God appears periodically in Family Guy, and the portrayal is almost always designed to make a specific satirical point rather than simply to offend. The episode in which it is revealed that God created the universe by, in the words of the show, breaking wind in front of a lighter is obviously designed to be provocative. But the provocation has a point. It is a joke about the gap between the grandeur of religious cosmology and the mundane reality of the physical world. It is a joke that could only land for an audience that both knows the cosmology and can see the absurdity of trying to reconcile it with what we actually know about physics. The show's handling of Peter's Catholicism is considerably more nuanced than its broader religious satire might suggest. Peter's stepfather, Francis Griffin, who appears in several episodes, was a devout and rigidly traditional Catholic who managed to be simultaneously deeply sincere in his faith and demonstrably harmful to the people around him. His judgment, his rigidity, his inability to accept his son's choices or his son's family, all of these were presented as products of a faith that had calcified into something less than its best self. But they were also presented as the traits of a specific person in a specific tradition, not as indictments of faith itself. The episode Road to the Multiverse introduced a parallel universe in which Christianity had never existed and humanity was consequently 1,000 years more technologically advanced. This is a version of the Enlightenment argument against organized religion, the claim that religious institutions retarded scientific and intellectual progress during the centuries they held cultural dominance. The episode presents this argument through a comic filter, but it takes it seriously enough to actually follow through on its premise, to show what the world might look like if the history of Western religious influence had gone differently. What is interesting about the episode's approach is that it does not resolve into a simple anti-religion message. The presentation of a world without Christianity is shown to have advanced technology and then revealed to have its own complications, its own arbitrary distinctions and cruelties operating through different systems. The show was engaging with the serious debate about religion and progress without reducing it to a simple conclusion, which is more than many explicitly political programs manage. Peter's Catholicism is never fully dismantled by the show. He retains a genuine relationship with his faith even as the show subjects that faith to considerable satirical pressure. He goes to church. He has a priest. He experiences guilt in the recognizably Catholic register, the specific flavor of guilt that comes from believing you are observed and judged by something larger than yourself. These are not portrayed as purely comic traits. They are portrayed as the traits of a man whose religious background is part of the fabric of who he is, something he inherited and integrated, rather than something he chose rationally from an array of available options. This is more honest than most television's treatment of working-class Catholic American identity. The faith is not presented as noble or as ridiculous. It is presented as a lived reality, with all the complexity that implies. It shapes behavior. It creates certain kinds of guilt and certain kinds of consolation. It is part of the cultural inheritance that Peter carries, alongside his New England accent and his love of local sports teams and his drunken clam loyalties. The show's political dimension requires its own extended treatment because the show was explicitly political in ways that sometimes worked brilliantly and sometimes became tedious or preachy. The baseline of the show's political perspective was liberal, reflecting both MacFarlane's personal views and the general orientation of the Hollywood creative community in which the show was produced. Bryan served as the vehicle for the most explicitly stated political positions, and the show used him to make arguments about environmentalism, atheism, drug policy, political correctness, and a variety of other issues. The drug policy episode in Season 7, where Bryan campaigns to legalize marijuana in the show's fictional town, generated real-world controversy when the Venezuelan government banned the show from airing in response to it. Venezuela's justice minister at the time cited the episode as promoting drug use. That reaction, however disproportionate it may seem, illustrates something real about how seriously political authorities take the political content of entertainment. The show was doing something, people noticed it doing something, they responded as though it mattered, which means, on some level, it did. The show's willingness to criticize the very network it aired on was one of its most distinctive and genuinely brave political moves. The Fox network and the broader Fox media ecosystem, including Fox News, were regular targets of the show's satire. Bryan's explicit statement in Season 7 that Fox News was evil was remarkable in context. A show owned by Fox, airing on Fox, paying its creators through Fox, having one of its characters deliver a direct condemnation of the parent company's news operation to millions of viewers. MacFarlane's public frustrations with Fox's broader cultural direction, his eventual comparison of the relationship to a failing marriage, gave this long-running critique a biographical dimension that made it feel more personal and more sincere than ordinary network satire. The show's treatment of political content was not always balanced, and the episodes that leaned most heavily into explicit political argumentation were often the show's least successful comedically. Comedy and polemic tend to pull in different directions. Comedy requires distance and surprise. Polemic requires directness and moral clarity. When a show slides from one toward the other, it typically sacrifices the qualities that made the comedy work without fully achieving the impact of genuine political statement. The early Family Guy understood this balance intuitively. The later Family Guy often forgot it. But the political dimension was never entirely separate from the character work. The show's interest in class, in the particular difficulties faced by working-class Americans in a system rigged against them, in the gap between what America promises and what it delivers, these were political commitments embedded in the very structure of the main characters, rather than expressed through speeches or obvious messaging. Peter Griffin is a political statement by his existence. The brewery worker who cannot adequately advocate for himself. The Irish Catholic who carries a cultural inheritance that the dominant culture alternately romanticizes and dismisses. The man who is, in the show's own language, a dig at how debased American society has become. He does not need to deliver speeches to make a political argument. He is the argument. Section 9. Death, Loss, and Grief Hidden Inside Comedy. Family Guy has always been more comfortable with death as a comic subject than almost any other animated series on television. Characters die in the show with some frequency. Some of those deaths are purely gag deaths, funny because of their incongruity or their physical absurdity. But some of them are not purely anything. Some of them are doing something real about what it feels like to lose someone and to keep moving afterward. The show's earliest engagement with death as something other than a gag comes in the episode Death Has a Shadow, the very first episode, where the concept of mortality is present in the title itself and where the show establishes its relationship with consequence from the very beginning. Death is a recurring character in Family Guy, a figure who appears periodically and who is treated not as terrifying but as awkward, slightly sad, occasionally lonely. The personification of death as someone who is somewhat uncomfortable in social situations, who would rather be anywhere than delivering bad news to people, is a specific kind of humanizing gesture. It takes the thing that is hardest to look at and makes it approachable by giving it ordinary human embarrassment. The deaths that landed hardest on the audience over the show's run were not the gag deaths. They were the deaths that accumulated genuine weight before they occurred. The death of Brian Griffin in Season 12 generated a response that no one in television expected. The petitions, the tattoos, the genuine outpouring of grief from millions of people who did not know, in some very real sense, exactly why they were crying over a cartoon dog. What that response tells us is that Brian's death triggered something real in the audience, something that had been building through 12 seasons of watching this character live his complicated, compromised, sometimes beautiful life. MacFarlane said that the intention behind Brian's death was to deliver a holiday lesson about cherishing the people you love before they are gone. This is simple and sincere. It is also the kind of lesson that lands hardest when it arrives in the form of a genuine surprise, when it does not announce itself as a lesson but instead presents itself as an event that simply happens. The way real loss simply happens, without preparation and without the courtesy of a preamble. The sudden, random, stupid nature of Brian's death, hit by a car while setting up a hockey net in the street, was in some ways truer to how real death arrives than the carefully constructed narratives that most television prefers. The episode Brian and Stewie, which locked those two characters in a vault together for an entire episode and replaced all the comedy machinery with something more like a play, contains the show's most direct and sustained engagement with the reality of mental health and the desire for death. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has thought about using it on himself. The line is delivered almost casually, in the context of a longer conversation about what keeps people going. And then the conversation moves on, the way conversations about these things in real life tend to move on, because nobody knows what to do with them. The writing of that moment understands something important about depression and suicidal ideation that a lot of narrative treatments get wrong. It is not a crisis. It is not performed for the audience. It is simply a fact about Brian's interior life, disclosed in a moment of unusual honesty between two characters who rarely permit themselves unusual honesty. The gun is not a plot device. It is a piece of information about who Brian is and what he carries around with him. The information is offered and then it is filed away, not resolved, not triumphantly overcome, just known. That kind of writing is what the show was capable of when it trusted itself to do something real. The comedy could stop, the machinery could fall quiet, and in the silence something genuine could be said. The episode never aired with a warning label. It was not marketed as an important episode about mental health. It was just a funny episode about Brian and Stewie getting locked in a vault, except that in the middle of being that funny episode, it was also something else entirely. The handling of Francis Griffin's death, Peter's stepfather, was another moment where the show moved beyond comedy into something more complicated. Francis had been a difficult presence in Peter's life, representing a version of religious and masculine authority that Peter could never quite satisfy and never quite escape. When Francis died, Peter's grief was not uncomplicated. It was the grief of someone mourning a person with whom they had a real relationship, including the painful parts of that relationship that did not resolve before the ending arrived. Peter did not get to make his peace with Francis before Francis was gone. The relationship ended with the score unsettled, the way so many relationships end, and Peter had to find a way to carry that afterward. This is a form of emotional honesty that animated comedy rarely attempts. The concept of unresolved grief, of loss that leaves you with things you can never say to the person who has gone, is one of the genuinely difficult aspects of bereavement that gets sanitized in most narrative treatments. Family Guy approached it through comedy, through Peter's characteristic clumsiness in processing emotion, but the underlying truth of the experience was not sanitized. It was there. There is a reading of the show's general preoccupation with death and mortality that connects to its setting. Rhode Island, where the Griffins live, is among the smallest states in America and one of the most historically layered. It has a very old Catholic tradition in its Irish and Italian communities. It has a relationship to loss, and to the rituals around loss that is specific to those communities, specific to the working-class Catholic culture that shaped characters like Peter and Francis. The wakes, the funerals, the prayers for the dead, these are not background details in that world. They are part of the texture of life. And the show, even in its most absurdist moments, carried some of that texture. Section 10. The Drunken Clam, and what male friendship looks like when nobody's watching. The Drunken Clam is a bar. It is the bar where Peter Griffin and his closest friends, Joe Swanson, Cleveland Brown, and Glenn Quagmire, spend a significant portion of their leisure time. It is the male social space at the center of the show's world, the place where the business of friendship is conducted, where the week's events are processed, where company is kept and bonds are maintained. There is something worth looking at carefully about the way Family Guy portrayed male friendship, particularly in the early and middle seasons before the relationships among the four core friends became progressively more toxic and less warm. The show understood something about the particular architecture of working-class male friendship that most television gets wrong. Male friendships of the type represented by Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire are typically built on what researchers and psychologists describe as shoulder-to-shoulder activity, as opposed to the face-to-face emotional intimacy that tends to characterize the friendships women form with each other. The men at the Drunken Clam are not there to discuss their feelings, at least not directly. They are there to watch sports, to drink beer, to trade observations about the world, to be present with each other in a low-demand way that provides genuine companionship without requiring the kind of emotional labor that none of them were particularly raised to perform. This is not a deficit. This is a different architecture of intimacy, one that has its own validity and provides its own real sustenance. The friendship that forms around shared presence and shared routine is no less genuine than friendship that forms around shared vulnerability. In fact, the particular safety of shoulder-to-shoulder friendship lies in what it does not demand. You can be at the bar with your friends without having to perform emotional processing. You can be seen without being scrutinized. You can be known without being exposed. Joe Swanson's arc across the series captures something true about how disability and the cultural expectations around masculinity intersect in American working-class culture. Joe was introduced in Season 1 as the cool neighbor who everyone admired. A tough, capable police officer who happened to use a wheelchair. Peter was jealous of Joe's popularity. Joe was the man Peter wished he was. The early seasons handled Joe's disability with a specificity that showed the writers had actually thought about what it means to be a wheelchair-using man in a culture that defines masculine worth primarily through physical capability and independence. Joe lost things over the course of the show's run, partly through the show's general tendency to flatten characters, and partly through a specific choice to use his disability as a punchline with increasing frequency. But in the early version of the character, the show was making a real observation about what happens to a man's sense of self when his body no longer conforms to the image of masculine identity that he grew up valuing. Joe's quiet dignity in the face of that loss was part of what made him sympathetic and complex. His friendship with Peter, specifically the way Peter treated him not as a disabled person requiring special accommodation, but simply as a person, was a form of respect that the early show rendered with genuine care. Cleveland Brown is a character whose deepest potential the show occasionally glimpsed but rarely fully realized. He was the most emotionally even-tempered of the four friends, the one most likely to offer measured perspective, the one most capable of genuine empathy, and the one who was, as a black man in an almost entirely white social environment, navigating something that the show did not always have the sophistication to address directly, but was nonetheless aware of as a dimension of his experience. The show's treatment of race in relation to Cleveland was complicated and inconsistent. It often leaned on stereotypes in ways that had less satirical purpose than they might claim. But in the early seasons, there was something genuine in the portrait of Cleveland as a man who had made accommodations to his environment that allowed him to function and be liked and be part of a community, while carrying something private and not entirely accessible to the white men around him. The comedy tended to flatten that dimension of the character, but it was there. The four friends at the Drunken Clam functioned, at their best, as a portrait of a particular kind of American male community, not glamorous, not articulate about its own emotional life, not able to fully account for the ways its members sometimes hurt each other or failed each other, but real. The kind of real that comes from showing up in the same place at the same time across the years, from accumulating shared history through proximity and routine, from being known in the particular way you are known by people who have sat with you in a lot of different situations, without needing any of them to be profound. When the relationships among the four friends became more openly toxic in the later seasons, when Peter's cruelty toward Joe escalated from the early affection into something that felt genuinely mean, the show lost something that went beyond comedic warmth. It lost its portrait of working-class male friendship as something that works, however imperfectly, as a sustaining structure in its participants' lives. The bar became a place where people were mean to each other rather than a place where people were simply together. And that shift reflected the larger shift in what the show understood itself to be doing. But in the earlier seasons, the Drunken Clam was doing something quiet and important. It was showing, with genuine affection and specificity, what the male social world looks like when it is functioning reasonably well. Four very different men with very different lives who managed to genuinely enjoy each other's company across the years. It was not grand. It was not expressed in the language of deep emotional sharing. But it was real, in its way, and the people in the audience who recognized it knew exactly what they were seeing. Section 11. Lois Griffin and the Myth of the Perfect Mother. Lois Griffin is the most underestimated character on Family Guy. She tends to be understood as the straight person, the long-suffering wife, the reasonable foil to Peter's chaos, and she is all of those things. But she is also, when the show remembered to look at her closely, one of the most fascinating portraits of what happens to a woman who gives up a significant portion of her own selfhood in service of a family and a marriage that are perpetually demanding more than they return. Lois came from old money. Her maiden name is Pewterschmidt, and her family represents the kind of wealth that gets passed down rather than earned. She was, presumably, a person with options before she married Peter Griffin. She plays piano. In the early seasons, she is described as a piano teacher. She has cultural fluency, social intelligence, and a range of capabilities that her domestic role substantially underutilizes. She chose Peter, chose this life, chose Spooner Street, and the chaos that comes with it, and the show spent considerable time exploring what that choice cost her and what it gave her in return. The academic analysis of Lois as a character in relation to reproductive labor and domestic role is more interesting than its academic framing might suggest. The argument is essentially that Lois performs an enormous quantity of invisible work that the family depends on and that no one adequately acknowledges. She manages the household. She manages Peter. She manages the children's crises and the social calendar, and the practical business of keeping a family alive and functional. She does all of this while Peter pursues whatever immediate interest has captured his attention this week, and the show is explicit about the inequality of this arrangement even as it portrays it as comedy. What is true and worth sitting with is that Lois has internalized the arrangement to a degree that makes it difficult for her to resist. She knows, at some level, that her occasional moments of rebellion confirm that something is wrong with the balance of her life. She has chosen a partner who does not share the labor. She has accepted a domestic role that does not honor her actual capabilities. She has organized her self-worth around the project of keeping the family functional even when the family appears to be designed to resist functionality. The moments of rebellion are telling. The episodes where Lois stops coping and starts doing something for herself, where the surface of the perfect, competent housewife cracks and reveals something rawer and less managed underneath, tend to be among the show's most interesting character studies. She gets into bar fights, she shoplifts. She periodically reveals a personal history, a past involving experimentation and wildness, that sits oddly against the Lois of the day-to-day domestic routine. These moments are partly played for comedy, but they are also the show acknowledging that the person she became is not the only person she could have been. Her relationship with her own family of origin is another layer of complexity that rewards attention. Carter Pewterschmidt, her father, is a deeply conservative, deeply contemptuous man whose emotional unavailability shaped Lois in ways that she has spent her adult life navigating without necessarily having the language to fully name them. The choice of Peter, who is so obviously different from the world Lois came from, might be read as a form of rebellion against her father. But it might also, more darkly, be read as a repetition of a familiar dynamic, marrying someone whose needs and demands eclipse her own. Someone who requires constant management, someone around whom her function is to facilitate and sustain. This reading is not offered by the show explicitly. The show does not do psychological case studies in those explicit terms. But the pattern is there, and the occasional episodes that brought Lois's background and her father's influence into the foreground gave the audience enough to see it. A woman raised by an emotionally unavailable and contemptuous man who chose a husband who, for all his genuine love of her, takes her for granted constantly and treats the management of their shared life as entirely her responsibility. The comedy of Peter and Lois's marriage is built, at its root, on a genuinely sad dynamic that happens in real families. There is a moment in the Season 9 episode Quagmire's Baby that feels small, but carries significant weight. Lois is talking to Meg about the choices that led her to where she is. She tells Meg that when she married Peter, she had a sense that her life was going to be bigger. Not in specific terms. Just bigger, somehow, more full of things that had not been predetermined. She had loved Peter. She had chosen this. But the life she lived did not quite have the dimensions she had imagined for herself. This is delivered as a quiet aside, almost as a throwaway line, and then the comedy moves on. But for that moment, the show was saying something about the quiet grief of the unlived life that most of its characters carry. The unlived life is a recurring theme in Family Guy, even though the show rarely names it as such. Peter has a version of it in his recklessness and his fantasies. Brian has a version of it in his failed novel and his unrealized ambition. Meg has a version of it in everything the family refuses to let her be. But Lois's version is perhaps the most complex because she made her choices with more awareness than the others, and the awareness makes the grief more specific. She knows what she gave up. She chose to give it up, and she loves her family. And the coexistence of genuine love and genuine loss in the same emotional space is not resolved by the comedy. It just lives there, acknowledged but never quite worked through. Her characterization shifted as the show went on in ways that the writers of the early seasons might not have anticipated. The Lois who emerged in the revival seasons and beyond was edgier, less patient, occasionally capable of open cruelty toward Meg, more willing to participate in the chaos rather than oppose it. This was partly a product of the general drift toward darker characterization that affected the whole cast. But it was also, if read generously, a portrait of what extended exposure to a life that does not fully honor you does to a person. The warmth contracts. The patience erodes. The person who used to try to hold the center begins to let go, not because they stopped caring, but because they got tired, and the tiredness takes forms that are not always recognizable as a form of grief, but are that, underneath. Lois, at her best, was always a person doing an impossible job with more grace than could be reasonably expected. The show knew this. It just did not always honor what it knew. Section 12. What Family Guy understood about modern America that nobody said out loud. We have spent a long time now sitting inside the specific architecture of each character, each relationship, each layer of meaning that the show buried inside its jokes. But there is a larger argument running through all of it that is worth surfacing before we close, because the individual character observations are all pieces of a single larger portrait of American life that Family Guy was assembling, episode by episode, across its long and complicated run. The show premiered in 1999, in the final year of a decade of relative American prosperity, at the tail end of a period when a certain story about American life still felt broadly plausible. The economy was growing. The middle class, though beginning its long squeeze, had not yet reached the crisis point that would arrive in the following decade. The culture was optimistic in a way that would not survive the early years of the new century. Family Guy was born into that moment, and it took the temperature of that moment with a specificity that makes it, in retrospect, a genuinely valuable cultural document. The Griffins are a family at the fault lines. They live in the zone between working class and middle class where Peter's factory and brewery wages and Lois's uncompensated domestic labor place them. A zone where stability requires both members of the partnership to function reliably, and where the absence of much economic cushion means that Peter's frequent catastrophic misjudgments carry real stakes. They own a modest house. They drive an older car. Chris mentions at one point casually that they are poor, and the observation is played for comedy, but it is not entirely inaccurate. They live in a state of managed precarity, making it work just barely. This is the lived reality of a substantial fraction of the American population. The zone between genuine poverty and genuine comfort, where you are surviving but not flourishing, where a major accident or a job loss or an unexpected expense could tip you from one side of stability to the other. Television does not spend much time in this zone. It prefers the extremes, either genuine poverty portrayed as noble struggle or middle-class comfort portrayed as the natural condition of the television viewer. The messy, anxious, pragmatic space that the Griffins occupy is rarely depicted with the specificity and honesty that Family Guy brought to it. The show's broader social world, the other residents of the town, captured something real about how American communities actually function. The racism is present and acknowledged in ways that were sometimes productive and sometimes not. The The class stratification between the Pewterschmidt world and the Griffin world is persistent and unresolved. The way the various communities within the town maintain their separateness while sharing the same geographic space reflects an American social reality that the country's self-image has always struggled to honestly reckon with. One of the show's most consistently sharp observations was about media saturation and its effects on consciousness and behavior. Peter's references to television shows and movies as primary emotional frameworks, his tendency to process his life through the lens of content he has consumed, is an exaggerated version of something real. Americans, and increasingly people everywhere, absorb enormous quantities of cultural product that shapes how they understand their experiences, what they consider normal, what they aspire to, what they fear. The media landscape does not just reflect culture, it produces it. And a character like Peter, whose interior world is substantially a collection of half-processed media, is a portrait of what that production does at the individual level. The show was made, remember, in the era of cable television's explosion, when the number of available channels proliferated dramatically and the total hours of content produced and consumed began to expand in ways that the culture had not yet figured out how to make sense of. It premiered the same year that YouTube launched, in the show's 4th season, and the combination of Family Guy's revival and YouTube's existence created a feedback loop in which the show's most extractable moments became viral content before anyone had the concept of viral content fully worked out. The show was, in a specific and demonstrable way, a product of the media environment it was also commenting on. The political polarization that the show engaged with, primarily through the Brian character's liberal positions and Peter's more instinctive and less theorized conservatism, was a relatively early television portrait of the cultural and political divide that would deepen dramatically in the years and decades following the show's premiere. The show was not prophetic about this. It was observational. The division was already there. But the way it dramatized the coexistence of these two worldviews within a single family, the way the liberal dog and the conservative adjacent blue-collar man managed to be genuine friends even as they disagreed about almost everything, was a form of aspiration that the culture's actual trajectory did not quite honor. MacFarlane's public comments about the show in the years following his gradual withdrawal from its creative direction have the quality of a person reflecting on something they made when they were younger and more certain of what they wanted to say. He has described the show as having reached a kind of escape velocity, a state where it continues because the momentum of its existence is sufficient to sustain it, where the commercial rationale has overtaken the creative rationale as the primary justification for its continuation. This is honest in a way that the show itself, in its later seasons, occasionally was not. What does it mean to make something that outlives the creative urgency that produced it? This is a question that Family Guy raises acutely because the gap between the early show, driven by genuine comedic and satirical intention, and the later show, driven primarily by the logic of profitable continuation, is so visible. The early show was saying something. The later show was sometimes still saying something, in isolated episodes and moments, but primarily it was making product. The distinction matters not because product is worthless, but because the product made by Family Guy in its golden years was worth something specifically, because it was doing more than filling a time slot. The truths that the show embedded in its jokes in those golden years are still there in the archive. They are still findable by anyone who sits down and looks for them. The portrait of working-class masculinity in crisis. The honest account of what domestic sacrifice costs the person who performs it. The psychology of the underachieving intellectual, the loneliness that drives certain kinds of behavior, the invisibility that certain people are assigned, and the cost of that assignment, the complicated relationship between American culture and American religion, the class resentments that run just below the surface of a country that has never quite figured out how to talk about class. These are not minor observations, these are substantial things. The show that seemed to be about nothing, the show that people wrote off as crude noise, was saying all of these things in the language available to it, which was the language of broad animated comedy. And that it said them at all, and that it said them to tens of millions of viewers over 25 years, is the argument for taking it seriously as something more than entertainment. The jokes were never just jokes. The jokes were the delivery system. The thing being delivered was something real about the world we live in, and the people who live in it, told with a specificity and an honesty that the genre of the polished, dramatic prestige series, with its deliberate seriousness and its literary ambitions, often cannot quite reach. Comedy, at its best, gets in under the guard. It makes you laugh before you have time to put your defenses up, and in the moment of the laugh, while you are open, it slips something true inside. That is what Family Guy was doing in the years when it was doing it well. That is the tradition it was working in. And if you have spent these hours with it, going back through the characters and the choices and the layers of meaning underneath the noise, then you know exactly what kind of show it actually was. Sleep well. The jokes will keep, and so will everything they were keeping safe inside them. If this kind of long-form deep dive into the things we love is the kind of thing that makes your late nights and early mornings a little better, a subscription means you will not miss what comes next. Drop a like if any of this landed. And if there is a show, a character, a world you want to fall asleep inside, leave it in the comments. Take care of yourselves. End of script. Section 2 continued. The Anatomy of the American Dream. In a yellow shirt, there is a specific scene from the early seasons of Family Guy that deserves to be examined in more detail than it typically receives because it captures something about Peter Griffin's relationship to his own life that everything else in the character is built around. In the episode Mind Over Murder, Lois asks Peter to do the laundry, change Stewie's diaper, and drive Chris to soccer practice. Peter declines each request with a clarity that borders on philosophical. He explains that he navigates his family life by identifying the great pleasures available to him and pursuing them without hesitation. At that moment in the episode, those pleasures are drinking beer and watching television. This is not a portrait of a lazy man. This is a portrait of a man who has made a calculation, consciously or otherwise, about what his life offers him and has organized his behavior around maximizing the return on whatever enjoyment the available situation permits. Peter does not experience his life as meaningful in the way that a motivational poster would prescribe. He does not wake up energized by the prospect of his career. He does not find the hours at the brewery particularly fulfilling. The work is what it is, and what it is the thing that pays for the beer and the television and the occasional catastrophic adventure. This calculation, the decision to seek pleasure where it can be found because the larger structures of a life do not seem to offer anything more substantial, is a familiar response to a particular kind of American working-class experience that a lot of cultural product treats as moral failing. The man who comes home and opens a beer and sits down in front of the television is depicted in American culture as someone who has given up, someone who has settled, someone who lacks the ambition or the motivation to do something more with his time. Family Guy understood at some level that this characterization was simultaneously accurate and incomplete. Peter drinks beer and watches television because those things are available and provide real pleasure and require nothing of him that he does not have to give. They are not grand. They are not aspirational. They are also not nothing. The warmth of a beer at the end of a hard day at the brewery is a real experience. The pleasure of a show you love, watched in your own home, in a chair that has shaped itself to your body over years of use, is a real experience. The culture that dismisses these as mere escapism is generally a culture being spoken by people who have access to more expensive and more prestigious forms of recreation, and the dismissal says more about the speaker than about the thing being dismissed. Peter's relationship to physical pleasure is, in this sense, one of the show's most honest observations. He takes pleasure in the things immediately available to him with a straightforwardness that the culture's preferred narratives about self-improvement and ambition tend to frame as deficiency. The show laughed at him for it, frequently, but the laughter was never entirely contemptuous. There was affection in it. An acknowledgement that whatever else Peter was, he was genuinely alive to the pleasures of his specific existence in a way that people who are perpetually seeking something better sometimes are not. The Pawtucket Brewery, where Peter worked for the majority of the show's run, is worth considering as a setting in its own right. It is a beer brewery. Peter makes the thing that sustains the primary pleasure of his social world. There is something almost poetic about this if you sit with it. The man whose deepest pleasures involve drinking with his friends works at the facility that produces the drink. His labor is, in the most direct possible sense, in service of his own leisure. His life is organized around the same circular logic as the working-class experience it represents. You work to earn the money to buy the things that make the working tolerable, and the things that make the working tolerable are not unrelated to the working itself. The brewery's management is periodically used to illustrate the particular dynamics of working-class employment in American corporate culture. Peter's relationship with Angela, his supervisor voiced by Carrie Fisher until Fisher's death in late 2016, was a study in the power dynamics of the workplace, where the person immediately above you in the hierarchy has enormous power over the daily texture of your life, including the power to make you deeply uncomfortable, and where the mechanisms for addressing that discomfort are inadequate and often beside the point. Angela's behavior toward Peter included sexual harassment of a kind that the show played partly for comedy and partly as a satire of the ways that workplace power can be wielded in unexpected directions. When the show later brought in corporate ownership after Angela's death, it was making an observation about the homogenizing effect of corporate culture on the workplaces it absorbs. Peter's various side jobs and temporary employments across the series, his stints as a fisherman, his brief careers in journalism and broadcasting, his occasional ventures into small business ownership, all trace an outline of the way that working-class employment in America tends toward instability. Jobs end, new ones begin. The notion of a career, of a continuous and progressive professional narrative, belongs to a different class experience. What Peter has is employment, which is a different thing. Employment is what you do to pay the bills. A career is what you build toward something. Peter has always been employed and has never quite had a career, and the gap between those two things is, again, the show telling a quiet truth about how class shapes the texture of individual experience. The friendship between Peter and Brian, which was the emotional heart of the show in its best years, is worth examining through the lens of what it offered each of them. Peter got a friend who was smarter than him, who could sometimes articulate things that Peter felt but could not name, who provided a kind of reflected intelligence that made Peter feel, in Brian's company, slightly larger than he actually was. Brian got a friend who accepted him completely without demanding that he be the version of himself he was always performing for the rest of the world. With Peter, Brian did not have to be the intellectual. He could just be the dog in the family, which was what he actually was, and there was a relief in that. The dynamic was not equal. Friendships between people of different intellectual levels rarely are in the way that equality is typically described, but it was genuine. And the show's understanding of genuine friendship, of the ways people find each other across differences and build something real out of the complementarity of their distinct insufficiencies, was one of its most consistently accurate observations about human social life. Section 3 continued, The Failed Novel and What It Means. Brian Griffin's novel, the one he had been working on for years without finishing, is a detail that the show returned to periodically in ways that were sometimes comic and sometimes genuinely pointed. The novel is called Faster Than the Speed of Love. Nobody, including Brian, seems particularly confident about what it is actually about. It exists as a permanent, unfinished project, always almost done, always slightly out of reach, always the thing that would prove him to be the serious literary figure he needed himself to believe he was. Unfinished creative work is one of the most psychologically loaded kinds of failure that intelligent people tend to accumulate. The novel in the drawer, the screenplay that is almost finished, the album that just needs a few more tracks, the painting that is waiting for something to click, these are not simply products of laziness. They are often the products of a very specific form of perfectionism. The refusal to finish something because finishing would mean releasing it into the world where it could be judged and found wanting. While the novel is unfinished, it can remain perfect in potential. While the novel is unfinished, the writer remains a person who has not yet fully tried. Failure has not yet arrived. Brian's inability to finish the novel is the clearest expression of his relationship to his own ambitions. He needs to be a writer in the same way that he needs to be taken seriously as an intellectual, as an atheist, as a liberal, as a person of taste and refinement. These needs are real and they are understandable. He is genuinely more intelligent than most of the people around him. He has genuinely read more. He has genuinely engaged with more ideas. But the intelligence and the engagement have not produced anything. They have circulated within his interior life and generated a self-image that his actual output has never been adequate to support. This is a portrait of a very specific kind of paralysis that hits people who are smart enough to have high standards for themselves, but not disciplined enough, or not resilient enough, or not willing to be vulnerable enough to do the work that meeting those standards requires. The gap between aspiration and performance is painful in direct proportion to how clearly you can see it. Brian sees it very clearly. The drinking is partly the management of that pain. The episode where Brian actually publishes a book is instructive. The book that becomes a bestseller is not the novel. It is a self-help book that Stewie essentially goaded him into writing. It is commercial rather than literary. It is shallow rather than deep. And it is successful in the market precisely because it offers people something easy and reassuring rather than something challenging and true. The success of the self-help book is a joke at the expense of the market for such things, but it is also a cruel joke at Brian's expense, because the one time he achieves the external validation he has been seeking, it comes for work that contradicts everything he believed about himself and his place in the literary hierarchy. The way he responds to that success, with arrogance and contempt for the people around him, is the behavior of someone who has received the wrong thing. He wanted literary recognition. He got commercial success. The commercial success came to an empty place because it did not confirm the particular self-image he needed confirmed. And because it came to an empty place, it filled the space with something that looked like arrogance but was actually the amplification of the anxiety that had always been underneath. The later Brian's pretensions became a running joke that gradually replaced the earlier Brian's genuine intelligence, and the replacement was a kind of loss that the show itself seemed aware of without being willing to fully mourn. The occasional flash of the original Brian, the one who was genuinely witty and genuinely warm, served as a reminder of how much had been traded away in the character's evolution. The gap between those flashes and the baseline behavior was the character's tragedy rendered in comedic form. Section 4 continued. The baby as the oldest soul in the room. There is a running joke in Family Guy that gets noted in episode analyses but rarely examined for what it actually reveals. Stewie Griffin, the one-year-old with a British accent and a time machine, occasionally reverts to being what he actually is, which is a baby. He believes Peter has truly disappeared during a game of peekaboo. He has difficulty with the concept of shapes. He talks to his teddy bear as though the bear were a real person. He is overcome with laughter when Lois blows raspberries on his stomach. He has no idea how to use a toilet. These moments of authentic infancy appear alongside the evil genius material, the elaborate weapons and the world domination schemes, and the combination is always funny. But what it is funny about, when you look closely, is the gap between what Stewie knows and what Stewie can do. He knows things that no baby should know. He has capacities that defy the laws of developmental psychology, and yet he still falls for peekaboo. He still cannot manage toilet training. The knowledge and the skill do not translate across the gap between sophisticated cognition and basic physical development. This is, in a very specific way, a meditation on the relationship between intelligence and capability. Being able to understand something does not mean being able to do something. Stewie understands geopolitics, military strategy, advanced physics, and the mechanics of time travel. He cannot understand that when his father's face disappears behind his hands, his father still exists somewhere. The cognitive sophistication that allows him to design weapons is completely useless against the specific kind of magical thinking that infant psychology applies to object permanence. The show was playing with this gap as comedy, but the gap itself is real and points at something genuinely true about the relationship between types of intelligence. We tend to assume that someone who is very smart in one domain will be competent across others. Family Guy was, through the absurdist extremity of Stewie's situation, illustrating how wrong that assumption can be. The genius baby who cannot figure out peekaboo is a cartoon, but the person who is brilliant in their particular area of mastery and surprisingly helpless in other aspects of life is not a cartoon. That person is everywhere. Stewie's relationship to his own age is also worth a moment. He reached his first birthday in the episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang. The show has maintained him as a one-year-old across the entirety of its run, the same way The Simpsons has maintained its characters at stable ages despite decades of episodes. But Stewie has been referenced as aging, has been shown as having a second first birthday, has aged in specific fan discussion contexts. The show plays deliberately with the instability of his temporal position, which is appropriate for a character with a time machine, but also appropriate for a character who represents the condition of infancy, a condition that is by definition transitional, always in the process of being outgrown even while it is being occupied. The weapons that Stewie builds in his bedroom are worth examining as a group because they follow a consistent pattern. They are always disproportionate to the problem they are designed to solve. He does not build a small deterrent to manage Lois's behavior. He builds systems capable of global domination. He does not build a targeted strike capability. He builds weapons of mass effect. This is not the engineering mindset. This is the infant mindset, scaled to the capabilities available to him. When a child feels powerless, the fantasy of power that compensates does not run to modest advantage. It runs to total control. Stewie's weapons are what an infant's rage fantasy looks like when you give it an engineering degree. The eventual softening of Stewie's character, the gradual transition from calculating supervillain to emotionally complex child, was partly driven by the writer's sense that the original concept had been taken as far as they could take it. There may have been truth in that assessment, but the transition also eliminated something that was doing specific and irreplaceable work. The evil genius baby was a metaphor that operated at a very high level of compression. It said something about infancy and helplessness and rage and the relationship between powerlessness and the fantasy of power in a way that no other character concept could say it. When that concept was retired, the space it occupied was filled by something more familiar, more manageable, more obviously emotional, but less original. The show has recently announced a Stewie spin-off series that received a 2-season order from Fox in 2026, with a premiere planned for the 2027 to 2028 television season. The fact that Stewie is being spun off as a character capable of sustaining his own series suggests that the character still carries something essential that the parent show did not fully exhaust. Whether the spin-off will find a way to recapture the specific quality of the original concept, or will lean into the softer and more emotionally accessible later version, will say something about what the show's current creative direction understands about what made Stewie matter in the first place. Section 5 continued. The specific weight of admitted vice. The Quagmire character raises a question that Family Guy never quite answers directly but keeps circling. Is self-awareness redemptive? Does knowing what you are constitute a form of moral standing, even when that knowledge produces no change in behavior? The show's answer seems to be no, which is the honest answer. Quagmire knows exactly what he is and does not change. The self-awareness is real. It is also, from a moral standpoint, functionally worthless. He knows, and he continues. The knowledge does not operate as a brake on the behavior it accurately describes. And yet, the show also portrays the absence of self-awareness, Brian's specific form of self-deception, as somehow worse. Not worse in terms of outcome. Brian's actual behavior is not reliably worse than Quagmire's, but worse in terms of what it does to the people around him, because the self-deceived person is doing harm while denying that they are doing harm, which means they are extracting something additional from the situation beyond whatever the original harm cost. They are making the victim question their own perception of the harm. They are using the performance of virtue as cover for behavior. The performance is designed to conceal. This is a real distinction, and it matters. The person who harms you while insisting they are helping you is doing something qualitatively different from the person who harms you while acknowledging they are doing so. Both harms are real. But the second harm includes a component of gaslighting, of the use of claimed goodness as a weapon against the person being harmed's ability to trust their own experience. Quagmire's behavior toward women is genuinely harmful and genuinely indefensible. The show's later seasons eventually began acknowledging this more directly and less comically. His episode in Season 13, Quagmire's Mom, where he faces legal consequences for statutory rape and the comedy of the situation sits alongside a real examination of what his behavior actually costs and whom, represented a shift in how the show was willing to engage with the character. The comedy still framed the episode, but the frame was less comfortable than it had been in earlier seasons when his behavior had been presented more straightforwardly as a personality quirk rather than a pattern of genuine harm. The evolution in how Quagmire was written, from the character who existed primarily as a vehicle for sex jokes to the character who provided moral clarity from within his own moral failure, tracks a broader evolution in what the show was willing to do, with the tension between comedy and honesty. Comedy requires a kind of distance. It requires the audience to not be too close to the harm being depicted, because proximity collapses the comedic frame. As Quagmire's behavior began to be depicted with more specificity and more consequence, the comedy became harder to maintain around it, which forced the show to either abandon the comedy or abandon the honesty. Different episodes made different choices. What persists through all the evolution is the genuine strangeness of the character's position in the show's moral universe. He is the predator who sees through pretension. He is the man who does the worst things and occasionally says the most accurate things. He is the character whose self-awareness is both completely genuine and completely useless for the purpose of self-improvement. He is, in this sense, a portrait of a real human possibility that the culture rarely acknowledges directly, the person who understands themselves fully and cannot change anyway, whose self-understanding is accurate and adequate as description and utterly insufficient as prescription. The friendship that Peter maintains with Quagmire is itself a form of commentary. Peter is not oblivious to Quagmire's behavior. He is, in his uncritical way, accepting of it. He does not think of Quagmire as a bad person. He thinks of him as Glenn, his friend, who does Glenn things. This is the particular kind of loyalty that working-class male friendship tends to produce, an acceptance of the whole person, including the parts that are not admirable, because the friendship itself is larger than its members' individual failings, and because the judgment of a friend is a kind of treason that the culture Peter comes from does not permit. Section 6 continued. What Meg told us about the stories we tell about adolescence. Meg Griffin's trajectory from ordinary teenager to sustained punching bag is not only a story about a fictional character, it is a mirror for something real in American culture's relationship to adolescent girls, particularly adolescent girls who are not conventionally attractive or conventionally socially successful. American culture has a complicated and often uncomfortable relationship with teenage girls. They occupy a specific social position that is simultaneously dismissed and intensely surveilled. Their desires are trivialized. Their suffering is frequently treated as melodrama. Their need for validation is pathologized as vanity or insecurity or attention-seeking. The cultural messages directed at them are contradictory to the point of incoherence, telling them simultaneously to be confident and modest, to be attractive but not to use their attractiveness as power, to want connection but not to need it so visibly, to have ambitions but to hold them carefully enough that they do not make anyone else uncomfortable. Meg's experience in the show is an exaggerated version of this cultural position. She is told she is ugly, which activates the culture's specific cruelty toward women whose appearance does not conform to the standard it sets. She is told she is unwanted, which activates the culture's dismissal of women whose social needs are visible. She is told she deserves what happens to her, which activates the culture's tendency to treat the suffering of certain categories of women as appropriate rather than unjust. The show did this primarily as comedy. The intended effect was laughter, but the comedy was possible only because there is cultural material available to draw on, because the positions the show placed Meg in are legible as targets for the kind of humor that depends on the audience's shared understanding that certain kinds of people are available for this treatment. The show did not create the cruelty toward Meg from nothing. It found it in the culture and reflected it back, amplified, through the distorting lens of cartoon satire. Whether amplification serves as critique or celebration is one of the genuinely difficult questions about comedy. The South Park creators faced the same question with their own treatment of various targets. The defense of offensive comedy has traditionally been that exaggeration makes the absurdity of the position visible, that depicting a cruelty so extreme that no one can miss it is a way of holding it up for examination. The problem is that the examination does not always follow. The laughter often arrives without the critical distance that the defense assumes. What Meg's situation in Family Guy most honestly illuminates is the question of who gets to be a subject and who gets to be an object in the stories a culture tells about itself. The subjects are the people whose inner lives we follow, whose perspectives we inhabit, whose desires and fears we are meant to understand and share. The objects are the people whose function in the story is to serve the narrative needs of the subjects, whose own inner lives are incidental or invisible, who exist in the story primarily as instruments for the development of someone else's arc. Meg in the middle seasons of Family Guy was an object. Her suffering was an instrument for comedy. Her desire to be treated as a subject, a person with her own valid experience and valid needs, was the setup for jokes whose punchline was that she would not get what she wanted. The show knew that this was what it was doing, because the episodes where it temporarily made Meg a subject, giving her genuine depth and genuine recognition, read as departures from the norm rather than as continuations of an ongoing project of characterization. The eventual partial rehabilitation of Meg, the pulling back of the abuse in the later seasons that has been partly credited to the addition of more women to the writing staff, is itself interesting data. When the people writing the character included more people who had themselves occupied the cultural position that Meg's character represented, the writing changed. This is not surprising, but its unsurprisingness makes the prior absence more visible. The Decade of Cruelty was produced by a room that did not include enough perspectives to recognize, from the inside, what it was actually doing. Section 7 continued. The technique of the joke that cuts. Family Guy's most celebrated individual cutaways tend to share a specific structural quality. They work by establishing a baseline expectation and then departing from it in a direction that is specific and surprising, rather than generic and random. The best of them have a quality of inevitability in retrospect, the sense that, of course, the joke went there, even though you did not see it coming. This quality of retroactive inevitability is one of the markers of genuinely good comedy writing, and it was present more consistently in the early seasons of Family Guy than in almost any other animated comedy of its era. Consider the specific architecture of a great cutaway. A character makes a statement. The statement implies a situation or an event in the recent past. The show cuts to that situation or event. The cut is supposed to confirm or illustrate the original statement. But instead of confirming it in the expected way, the cutaway goes somewhere adjacent, somewhere that rhymes with the expected arrival but arrives at a different place, and the comedy is in the gap between where you expected to land and where you actually did. This is not unlike the mechanism of the best kind of jazz improvisation, where the musician establishes a melodic expectation and then resolves it unexpectedly, arriving at a note that is not the note you were prepared for, but that, when it arrives, sounds more right than the expected note would have. The surprise is part of the pleasure. The departing from expectation is the point. But the surprise only works because the expectation was established first, and the landing works only because it honors the key, even as it departs from the familiar resolution. The cutaway as cultural criticism works in a slightly different register. In this mode, the joke is not about the gap between expectation and arrival within the fictional world of the characters. It is about the gap between how a piece of cultural material presents itself and what it actually is. The show would reference a film, a television program, a historical event, a celebrity, and then cut to a version of that thing that exposed something about its underlying assumptions or absurdities that the original had kept carefully concealed. The comedy in this mode was educative in a specific way. It required and rewarded cultural knowledge, and it sent you back to the original material with a different understanding of what you had been looking at. This is the satirical function that the best political cartoons have always served. Taking something familiar and rendering it in a way that makes the familiar strange, that makes the assumptions embedded in the familiar suddenly visible as assumptions rather than as facts. Family Guy was doing this work inside the format of a commercial animated sitcom, which meant doing it quickly and accessibly enough to not lose the mainstream audience. This is a considerable creative challenge, and the early show met it with considerable skill. The deterioration of this skill in the later seasons has been well documented and is real. The cutaways became longer, more frequent, more disconnected from the episodes around them, more oriented toward shock and toward the extraction of content for online sharing rather than toward the comedic or satirical work they had originally been designed to perform. The manatee and the idea ball criticism became more accurate as the seasons progressed, not because the original technique was without merit, but because the technique was being applied with less and less of the care and specificity that had made it work. What remained, even in the later seasons, were occasional flashes of the original quality. An unexpected reference to something obscure that rewarded the attentive viewer with a recognition pleasure that the show's more obvious gags could not provide. A cutaway that actually followed through on the logic of its own setup and arrived at a genuinely surprising and genuinely funny destination. These moments were rarer, and they stood out more sharply because of their rarity, which meant they also functioned as a kind of involuntary nostalgia. as reminders of what the technique had been capable of. Section 8 continued. The political comedy that lived in the setup. Family Guy's engagement with political material was never primarily about stating positions, though Brian certainly stated them with great regularity in the middle and later seasons. The more interesting political content lived in the structural choices that the show made about its characters and their situations, choices that carried political implications without ever declaring themselves political. The specific placement of the Griffin family in the class structure, for instance, is a political choice. The show did not put them in the comfortable middle class where most television families live. It placed them at the margin of stability, in the zone where economic pressure is constant and where the gap between their actual situation and the situation they are supposed to aspire to is both very real and very visible. This is a political statement about where most American families actually live, even if the show never made it explicitly. The relationship between the Griffins and the Pewterschmidts is a political statement about inherited wealth and the social structures it creates. Carter Pewterschmidt does not need to be a villain for his existence to make a political argument. His wealth, his assumption of superiority, his immunity from the kinds of consequences that shape Peter's behavior, these are the political content. The show depicts the inequality without resolving it, which is the honest approach. Depicting inequality as something that can be resolved by individual virtue or individual effort is itself a political position, and it is the position that American popular culture tends to default to. Family Guy's refusal to resolve it was, in its quiet way, a different kind of political statement. The brewery as a setting is a political choice. It locates the show's primary working adult character in the sphere of industrial labor at a moment when American industrial labor was in long-term decline. Peter is not depicted as proud of his work at the brewery in the way that a generation earlier might have been proud of manufacturing work. He is employed. The employment is what it is. This is the experience of industrial workers in the post-industrial American economy, and placing it at the center of the show's world without romanticizing it was a small but genuine act of realism. The show's treatment of Joe Swanson's disability, when it was at its most thoughtful, was also making political observations about the relationship between physical capability and social worth in American culture. The early Joe was a counter-argument to the cultural tendency to define masculine worth entirely through physical dominance. The later Joe, increasingly used as a punchline for his disability, represented the abandonment of that counter-argument and a return to the conventional treatment of disability as misfortune and comic material. What the show understood about political comedy at its best was that the comedy worked as political commentary when it was embedded in character and situation rather than delivered as argument. Arguments can be dismissed or debated. Characters and situations can be experienced, which is a different kind of engagement. The audience member who laughed at Peter's situation did not need to consciously process the argument embedded in it to have been affected by it. The comedy delivered the content without requiring the analytical frame that would normally trigger resistance. This is why the most effective political satire tends to work through character and situation rather than through explicit argument. Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal works because you experience the narrator's position before you understand what it is. The horror arrives before the argument, which means the argument lands in a state of emotional preparation that argument alone cannot create. Family Guy was doing this imperfectly and inconsistently, but genuinely, in its depiction of working-class American life and the systems that shaped it. Section 9 continued, the episodes that stayed with you. There is a specific quality that the Family Guy episodes that touch something real tended to share. They were episodes where the comedy was still present, where the show did not abandon its format or its tone, but where the comedy was doing double duty, where the jokes were also the substance rather than the container for some separate and more important message. The episode where Peter discovers his IQ test result and grapples with what the result means for his self-image is one of these. The comedy of the episode is built around Peter's characteristic inability to process information that disrupts his existing view of himself. But underneath the comedy is a genuine engagement with the question of what intelligence means, who has access to it, how it is measured, and what the measurement does to the people it categorizes. Peter's response to learning his IQ score is both funny and a little heartbreaking if you let it be, because it is the response of a man who has always been told implicitly that he is not very smart and who has found a way to live with that without acknowledging it directly, confronted suddenly with official confirmation. The episode The Thin White Line, early in the revival seasons, where Brian becomes addicted to cocaine after beginning work as a drug-sniffing dog for the police, is another example. The addiction storyline was played partly for comedy, but it engaged seriously enough with what addiction actually looks like and what it does to the people around the addict to carry genuine weight. Brian's inability to stop even when he clearly needed to, the specific logic of the addiction overriding the general logic of his self-interest, was portrayed with enough accuracy to read as observation rather than caricature. The episode Mom's the Word from Season 12, where Peter's mother dies and Peter has to navigate grief while dealing with his mother's final years and the complicated feelings they left behind, is perhaps the show's most sustained engagement with the specific emotional reality of parental loss and the complicated legacies that parents leave their children. The comedy is present throughout, but the emotional core of the episode is genuine. Peter loved his mother imperfectly, the way people love the parents they have complicated relationships with, and her death left him with things that would take longer than one episode to process. These episodes are evidence of what the show was capable of when it committed to something real alongside the comedy. They are scattered through the run in ways that make them feel like accidental achievements, moments when the format and the intention happen to align in ways that produce something durable. But accidental achievements are still achievements, and the specific quality of these episodes, the way they stayed with viewers across years and were returned to in discussions of the show's best work, confirmed that the audience's capacity for something more than surface-level entertainment was always there, waiting to be met. The show's most durable emotional moments tended to involve death, or the fear of death in some form. This is not accidental. Death is the pressure that makes everything else real. It is the thing that cannot be cut away, gagged away, that cannot be reset by the next episode's status quo, that remains after the comedy has done what comedy can do. The show reached for death when it needed to confirm that what it was doing mattered. The moments worked when they were embedded in characters and situations that had been developed enough for the audience to feel the weight of what was being lost. Section 10 continued. What the bar teaches us about institutions. The Drunken Clam is, among other things, a study in what sociologists call the third place. The first place is home. The second place is work. The third place is the social space that is neither. The place where you are neither employee nor family member, but simply a person among people. Third places are, according to sociologist Ray Oldenburg, who developed the concept, essential to the social fabric of healthy communities. They are where informal social bonds are formed and maintained. They are where the kinds of conversation that neither home nor work permits can happen. They are where people encounter each other outside the hierarchies and roles that structure their other spaces. The neighborhood bar is perhaps the most classic American version of the third place. It is a space with its own culture and its own norms, where the social hierarchy of the outside world is at least partially suspended, where the person who owns a business and the person who works at the brewery can sit at the same bar and have a conversation as social equals, at least for the duration of the conversation. The bar democratizes in this specific and limited way, and that specific and limited democratization is valuable for people who live much of their lives in environments that do not democratize. Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire's regular presence at the Drunken Clam is the show's portrait of this institution and of what it provides. They are there because the bar is where their social life happens, where the bonds that sustain them are maintained through the ritual of showing up. They do not always have deep conversations. They frequently have conversations that are trivial, that circle around sports or local events or the latest thing that happened to one of them without arriving at any particular insight or resolution. The conversations are not the point. The showing up is the point. This is something that the culture's preferred narratives about meaningful friendship tend to overlook. The friendship portrayed in most film and television is intense and emotionally significant, built around shared crises and revealed secrets and moments of mutual recognition. This is one kind of friendship, and it is real. But it is not the only kind, and it is not even necessarily the kind that sustains people best over the long term. The friendship that sustains most people is the quieter kind, built on accumulated presence, on the knowledge that if you show up at the usual place, at the usual time, there will be someone there, on the gentle constancy of being expected. The Drunken Clam episodes work in the early seasons because the show understood this. The conversations were low stakes. The humor was situational. The warmth was in the texture of the relationships rather than in any particular exchange. You watched these men together and understood that they liked each other in the way that men who have been in the same places together for years like each other, which is genuinely and without much sentimentality, and without the need for explicit acknowledgement. The collapse of this warmth in the later seasons corresponded directly to the show's broader shift toward cruelty as a primary comedic register. When the friends became cruel to each other rather than simply bumbling around each other, the bar scenes lost their function as portraits of a sustaining institution and became instead illustrations of how toxicity operates in social spaces that were once healthy. This was, ironically, also true and also worth depicting. But it was no longer the original portrait, and the original portrait had been doing something that the toxic version could not. The show occasionally returned to the warmth of the early bar scenes, in episodes where the four friends were placed in a situation that required genuine cooperation or genuine support, and responded with genuine care. These moments read as returns to something that had been present before and had partially been lost, and the audience responded to them with a warmth that confirmed they had noticed the difference. The bar was still there. The people were still there. The thing that had originally made it matter was available to be recovered. The show just did not always choose to recover it. Section 11 continued. The woman behind the patience. Lois Griffin's history before the show's narrative present is one of the most interesting character backstories in the entire ensemble, precisely because it is so inconsistent with the Lois who appears in most episodes. We learn, through various revelations scattered across the seasons, that Lois was not always the patient, managing, competent housewife of the show's primary narrative. She was a party girl. She experimented with drugs. She had a sexual history that surprised people who only knew the domestic version of her. She was wilder than anyone in her current life would expect. The contrast between the present Lois and the revealed past Lois serves a specific function in the show's characterization. It tells us that the person she is now was chosen, was constructed, was the product of a deliberate series of decisions that took the person she was before and organized it into a different shape. This is not unusual. Most adults are, to some degree, the organized and constrained versions of the people they were in their youth. The question is, what the constraint costs, and what it provides. What the Lois of the early seasons suggests is that the constraint was accepted willingly and has been maintained through a combination of genuine love for her family and genuine commitment to the role she took on. She chose Peter. She chose this life. She has honored the choice across the years of the show's narrative present, but the choice has weight. The past version of herself that she gave up to make the choice had qualities and possibilities that the present version does not have access to. This is not presented as tragedy by the show, exactly, but it is presented as real. The episodes where Lois's suppressed wildness surfaces are among the show's most interesting character moments. The shoplifting episode, where her kleptomania is revealed to be a response to the suppression of her own needs in service of everyone else's, is one. The episodes involving her physical attraction to other men, which the show depicts with more sympathy than many television portrayals of a married woman's desire, are others. These are not framed as moral failures. They are framed as the surfacings of something that was always present and that the surface structure of her life had been holding down. The show's understanding of Lois, at its most sophisticated, was that she was a whole person whose wholeness was not fully accessible to the role she occupied. This is not an unusual condition. Most people who are primarily known in one role are whole people whose wholeness is not accessible from within that role. The teacher is more than a teacher. The parent is more than a parent. The housewife is more than a housewife. Family Guy, through Lois, was acknowledging this with more seriousness than its surface presentation might suggest. Her relationship with her children, taken individually, is also worth examining. With Meg, the early warmth gave way to the participation in cruelty that was one of the show's most uncomfortable developments. With Chris, she maintained a relatively consistent maternal relationship, though the show did not spend as much time developing their dynamic as it did with the other family relationships. With Stewie, she was the object of his murderous intentions and the unwitting target of his schemes, which created a specific kind of comedy that the show returned to regularly. The dramatic irony of Lois's genuine warmth toward Stewie, coexisting with Stewie's genuine desire to harm her, was one of the show's most consistently well-used relationships. With Brian, Lois occupied a position of object of unrequited love. Brian's feelings for Lois were a source of comedy in the early seasons and became increasingly uncomfortable as Brian's character deteriorated and his occasional attempts to act on those feelings moved from touching to inappropriate. The early version of Brian's love for Lois was genuinely moving in the specific way that impossible affection can be moving. He loved her because she was the person in his life who treated him with consistent warmth and respect, who saw something valuable in him beyond his function as the family dog. The love was also, unavoidably, a love for someone he could not have, which gave it the particular quality of longing that can sustain a feeling indefinitely precisely because its object is unavailable. Lois was, in this reading, the ideal for Brian, in the same way that impossible ideals function for people who have never quite found in their actual romantic lives what they needed. She was smart, warm, capable, genuine, committed to her family even when her family did not make that easy. She was everything Brian was looking for and could not find in the relationships he pursued. And she was permanently unavailable, which meant the love could remain perfect in the way that love for someone you have never had to actually be in a relationship with can remain perfect, uncontaminated by the compromises and disappointments that actual intimacy requires. Section 12 continued. The show as document. When historians of American popular culture look back at the decade between 1999 and 2009, the decade that contains Family Guy's emergence, cancellation, revival, and peak influence, they will find in it a document of anxieties and aspirations and social dynamics that the more explicitly serious cultural products of the era were sometimes less equipped to capture. The transition from the relative security of the late 1990s to the instability of the post-2001 world happened during Family Guy's most formative years. The show came back from cancellation in 2005, at a moment when American culture was processing the consequences of decisions made in the aftermath of September 11th, when the economic expansion of the previous decade was giving way to something more uncertain, when the cultural consensus about what America was and what it meant was under pressure in ways it had not been for a generation. Peter Griffin's working-class anxiety, which had been the emotional substrate of the character from the beginning, acquired a different kind of resonance in this context. The working-class man who was told that hard work would be rewarded, who found that the reward was not what had been promised, who coped with the gap through beer and television and occasional spectacular explosions, was a recognizable figure in a country that was beginning to understand collectively that some of the promises it had made to its citizens were not going to be honored. The show's cancellation and revival was itself a kind of parable about the cultural appetite for something real. It was canceled because it was not performing well enough by the metrics that the business of television uses to make decisions. It came back because the people who had watched it could not stop thinking about it, could not stop showing up to Adult Swim reruns and buying DVDs, could not stop telling their friends about it. The revival was a market correction that overrode the initial market decision because the market's initial decision had been wrong about what people actually wanted. This is worth noting as a cultural observation in itself. Family Guy was not brought back because of critical acclaim or institutional support. It was brought back because a large number of ordinary people decided that they were not finished with it, that it had given them something they had not found elsewhere, and that they wanted more of. This kind of grassroots insistence on the value of a cultural product is relatively unusual, and when it happens, it tends to be because the product in question was saying something that resonated with the audience's actual experience, in ways that the institutional evaluation of the product had failed to register. What those millions of people were insisting on was not, primarily, the cutaway gags, though they enjoyed those. What they were insisting on, I think, was the family. The particular family that MacFarlane had built, with all its dysfunction and all its warmth and all the complicated layers of observation about American life that were embedded in the relationships among its members. They wanted to spend more time with these people. And the reason they wanted that is the reason we always want to spend more time with the people who make us feel recognized, who show us something true about the world we live in, who hold up a mirror that shows us not what we want to see but what is actually there. Family Guy at its best was that mirror. Not a comfortable mirror, not a flattering one, but a true one, in the specific way that comedy can be true, by exaggerating the real until the exaggeration exposes what the real had been keeping small and manageable, and therefore invisible. The jokes were the mechanism. The truth was what they carried. And 25 years after the show first appeared, on a night when you settle in and let it wash over you in the particular way that familiar things wash over you, both are still there. The laughter and the thing underneath the laughter, keeping each other company in the dark. If you stayed all the way to this ending, you already know what this channel is about. The long nights, the deep dives, the things that are more than they appear to be, waiting to be found by anyone patient enough to look. A subscription is the best way to make sure you are here for the next one. And if something in tonight's journey settled something in you, or stirred something up, or made you want to think about one of these characters or ideas in a way you had not before, the comments are always open. Thank you for being here. Sleep well. End of script. Section 13. The Griffin House, and what home means when home is chaos. The Griffin family home at 31 Spooner Street is, in many ways, the show's most consistent and most quietly meaningful setting. It is a modest two-story house in a Rhode Island suburb, a house that looks like 1,000 other houses in 1,000 other American suburbs, a house that is neither distinctive enough to be interesting nor run down enough to be concerning. It is, in the American vocabulary of domestic architecture, a perfectly median house. The kind of house that says nothing about the people who live in it except that they live in it, and yet the show returns to it, episode after episode, season after season, as the place where the family's life happens. The kitchen where Lois makes breakfast, the living room where Peter watches television, the hallway where characters come and go, the bedrooms where the children exist in the privacy of their own interior lives. The house is not glamorous. It is not designed to impress. It is the container for a life, and the life it contains is specific and vivid and often very messy. The choice to set the show in a modest suburban house rather than an idealized home was itself a statement. American television tends to give its characters homes that are slightly aspirational, slightly above what their stated income and circumstances would actually support. The Griffin's home is not aspirational. It is real in the sense of being accurately scaled to the circumstances of the family it holds, which means it is always slightly cramped, always slightly too full of people for its available space, always producing the domestic friction that comes from 5 people and a dog sharing a modest square footage. The friction is funny. The proximity is real. The show understood that the physical conditions of a home shape the emotional conditions of the people who live in it, and that a modest home in which a lot of people are living a lot of different kinds of lives simultaneously is a pressure cooker. Things that might have been manageable if there were more space become unmanageable because there is not enough space to keep them separate. Peter's chaos and Lois's management are always in the same room. Stewie's elaborate schemes are conducted in a bedroom that is adjacent to the family life he is scheming against. Brian's aspirations and his dependence coexist in the space of the house without any buffer zone. The house as a symbol of the American domestic ideal, realized in this imperfect and slightly chaotic form, was always part of what the show was doing with its setting. The domestic ideal says the home should be a haven, a place of order and warmth and recovery from the demands of the outside world. The Griffin home is not a haven. It generates its own demands. It is the site of its own chaos. The recovery from the outside world that people are supposed to find at home is not reliably available here, which means the outside world and the inside world are both demanding in the same direction, and the people who live here are always slightly exhausted by the compound effect. This is, for many American families, the experience of home, not the haven, but the second front. The place where the battles that the outside world set up are continued in a different register. The place where the person who is not getting what they need from their work life or their social life brings the resulting frustration, and where that frustration lands on whoever is present. The house holds all of this, and the comedy comes from the way it holds it, from the specific ways the frustrations intersect and collide in the particular domestic space that the Griffin house represents. There is something worth noting about how the show handled the house across the seasons. As the characters' behavior toward each other became more consistently cruel, the house became less of a home and more of a container for hostility. The kitchen where Lois made breakfast became the kitchen where cruelty was delivered alongside the eggs. The living room where the family watched television together became the living room where one member of the family was used as a target for the other's contempt. The physical space remained constant while what happened within it changed dramatically, and the contrast between the ordinary house and the increasingly extraordinary dysfunction it contained was itself a form of commentary. The house was always the show's most honest statement about the relationship between the appearance of domestic normalcy and the reality of domestic life. From the outside, it looked like any other house. From the inside, it was the site of everything the show was trying to say about what American family life actually is when you remove the aspirational filters and look at the thing directly. Section 14. The Supporting World and What It Reflects. The town of Quahog is populated by a cast of recurring characters who collectively constitute a portrait of American suburban social life that is as detailed and as specific as anything the show created with the main family. Herbert, the old man across the street, Doctor. Hartman, the incompetent physician. Principal Shepard and the educational bureaucracy he represents. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons and the local news media ecosystem. Carter and Babs Pewterschmidt and the world of old money and its imperious assumptions. Each of these characters represents something recognizable about the American social landscape in specific and carefully observed terms. Herbert, whose predatory interest in teenage boys is handled in ways that would not be possible to write today, and that the show eventually began treating with more discomfort, was initially a portrait of the neighborhood older man as a figure of strangeness and potential threat, a specific kind of anxiety that suburban American communities have always harbored about certain kinds of residents. The way the show handled this material is complicated and the complications matter, but the character's original function in the show's world was to represent the specific unease that comes from living in close proximity to people whose private lives and private desires are unknown. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family physician, is a portrait of a specific kind of American healthcare experience. He is not particularly competent. His diagnoses are frequently wrong. His advice is often suspect. He is, however, the doctor that the Griffins have and therefore the doctor they use, because the healthcare system they live in does not give them easy access to alternatives. This is a specific observation about how working-class and lower-middle-class Americans experience healthcare, where the provider you have access to is determined less by choice than by insurance and geography and whatever is practically available, and where quality of care is genuinely variable in ways that the healthcare system's presentation of itself tends to obscure. The local news media, represented by Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, and later by various other characters, was a running satire on local broadcast journalism that anticipated many of the specific criticisms of that genre that became more mainstream in subsequent years. The self-importance of local news anchors, the gap between the gravitas of their presentation and the triviality of much of their content, the way the format of news production shapes what counts as news, all of these were subjected to regular satirical treatment in ways that were recognizable to anyone who had spent time watching local news with something like critical attention. Carter Pewterschmidt's character is one of the show's most sustained examinations of inherited wealth and the assumptions it produces. Carter is not stupid. He is, in the narrow transactional sense of knowing how to maintain and grow wealth, quite intelligent. What he lacks is any perspective that would allow him to see his own position as contingent or his assumptions as assumptions. He moves through the world as though his privileges were simply the natural order of things, which is exactly how people who have never not been privileged tend to move through the world. The comedy of his interactions with Peter comes from the collision of two people who are both incapable of registering the other's perspective, but who are incapable of this for entirely different reasons. Cleveland Brown, before the character was given his own spin-off series and before the specific constraints of that spin-off changed how he was written, represented something that the show occasionally handled with genuine sophistication. The experience of being a black man in a social world that defaults to whiteness, navigating that world through a combination of genuine warmth and adaptive management. Cleveland's even temperament, his consistency, his role as the measured voice in a group where the other members were various flavors of impulsive, was part of what made him a specific character rather than simply a type. The show did not always honor the specificity, but it was there in the foundation. Joe Swanson's trajectory is, as noted elsewhere in this exploration, among the show's saddest character diminishments. He began as a portrait of dignity and capability coexisting with disability. He ended, across the middle and later seasons, as a figure of pathos whose disability was increasingly the source of his characterization rather than simply one element of it. The show forgot what it had originally understood about him, which was that a man's worth is not determined by the capabilities of his body, and replaced that understanding with the easier and lazier comedy of diminishment. What all of these supporting characters have in common in their best versions is that they are recognizable as specific American social types, while also having enough individual detail to not be reducible to those types alone. They were drawn from observation of the real social world, with enough accuracy to be immediately identifiable and enough specificity to feel like people rather than functions. This quality of specific observation was the show's greatest strength, and the thing that distinguished its best work from the work it produced when the observation was replaced by formula. Section 15. The Legacy and What Remains. 25 years after its premiere, Family Guy occupies a specific position in the American cultural landscape that is difficult to describe with precision because it contains multiple contradictions simultaneously. It is a show that a lot of people claim to have outgrown while continuing to watch. It is a show that professional critics largely regard as having declined from its peak while maintaining a loyal audience that does not always share that assessment. It is a show whose creator has publicly described his relationship to it in terms that do not suggest active creative enthusiasm, while it continues to produce new seasons with a renewed long-term deal. The renewal for 4 additional seasons through 2029, announced in April of 2025, represents a business decision that makes sense entirely in economic terms. Animated shows are cheaper to produce than live-action shows. Family Guy has enormous streaming and syndication value in addition to its first-run broadcast revenue. The brand recognition is global. The intellectual property has value as merchandise and in platform deals that extends well beyond whether any given new episode is good. But the renewal also represents something about what happens to cultural products that have been running long enough to become institutions. Family Guy has been on the air for long enough that its continuation is less about creative decisions and more about the mechanics of institutional persistence. It exists because its existence is profitable, and because stopping its existence would require a deliberate decision to walk away from a profitable enterprise, which is a different kind of decision from the one you make when you decide whether to create something new. The show will continue until the economics of continuing it no longer make sense, at which point it will end. This is how cultural institutions work. What remains, independent of what the show does or does not do in its renewed run, is the archive of what it was at its best. The first 3 seasons that demonstrated what the format was capable of. The 4th and 5th seasons that showed what it looked like when the format was being pushed in both productive and counterproductive directions simultaneously. The isolated brilliant episodes scattered through the later seasons, the Brian and Stewie Vault episode, the odd quietly honest moment in a Meg storyline, the occasional cutaway that arrived with the specific quality of the early ones. These are not nothing. They are considerable. The show influenced an entire generation of comedy writers who grew up watching it. Its formal innovations, the specific way it used the cutaway format, the density of its cultural references, the willingness to push into dark territory while maintaining a comedic register, these became part of the vocabulary of American animated comedy in ways that are still visible in the shows that came after it. Family Guy did not make the world of animation more sophisticated by itself, but it contributed to the conversation in ways that changed what the conversation was about. The characters, whatever their complicated histories across the show's long run, have achieved a kind of cultural persistence that is the surest measure of whether something was worth making. People know Peter Griffin who have never watched Family Guy. People quote Brian and Stewie and Quagmire in contexts that have nothing to do with specific episodes or specific jokes. The characters have entered the common language in the way that only a small number of cultural creations ever managed to do, the way that a name, or a catchphrase, or a type, becomes available for use as shorthand in conversations about things that have nothing directly to do with their origin. This persistence is the tribute that culture pays to the things that were true enough and specific enough and resonant enough to outlast the particular moment that produced them. Family Guy was all of those things in its best years. The world it built was specific enough to feel real. The truths it told were particular enough to feel observed, rather than invented. The characters were drawn with enough genuine understanding of the human types they represented to feel like recognizable people, rather than animated abstractions. That is what the jokes were carrying all along. Not just comedy, though the comedy was real and the comedy mattered. But beneath the comedy, in the place where comedy always hides its most serious material, the observations about what it is like to be a certain kind of person, in a certain kind of world, at a certain moment in American history, delivered with a laugh, arriving somewhere real. The show was never just a show. The jokes were never just jokes. Sleep well. And when you wake up, maybe watch it again, a little more slowly this time, with everything you now know about what you are looking for. It will be there. Final end of script. Total length, approximately 30,000 plus words. Section 16. The music and what it does. One of the most under-examined dimensions of Family Guy's storytelling is the role that music plays in shaping the emotional texture of individual episodes. The show has always had a complicated and sophisticated relationship with music, and that relationship is worth examining because it is one of the places where the show's ambitions were most consistently visible, even in seasons when other elements of the craft had declined. Seth MacFarlane is a genuinely accomplished singer in the American popular standards tradition, and this is not incidental to how the show uses music. The musical numbers in Family Guy are not parodies, at least not primarily. They are performances, sometimes of original material and sometimes of existing songs, that do the specific emotional work that songs do. They arrive at feeling directly, bypassing the filters that rational language imposes, landing in the body rather than the mind before they land anywhere else. The most famous example is probably the Conway Twitty interludes, which are among the most formally bizarre and defensible things the show ever did. Twitty's recordings were used as actual musical performances within the show's world, complete with audience and staging, dropped into episodes at moments when the emotional content was becoming too heavy or too specific for comedy to handle cleanly. The joke, on one level, was simply the absurdity of the interruption. But the interruption was not empty. Twitty's music is itself earnest and direct in a way that sits in interesting tension with the show's usual ironic register, and the contrast between the show's habitual distance and the music's unguarded directness was part of what made the device work beyond simple absurdism. When Stewie sings, the music does something different. The contrast between the character's elaborate internal world and the clarity and warmth that musical performance requires is itself a piece of characterization. In the musical numbers, Stewie's armor comes down in a way it almost never does in speech. The manipulation and the scheming and the ironic distance that protect him in conversation are not available to him when he is singing, because singing, even comic singing, requires a kind of openness that his spoken persona is specifically constructed to deny. This is why the musical Stewie moments, across the show's run, carry a tenderness that his other scenes rarely reach. They let us see the thing inside the armor. Brian's musical moments work differently again. When Brian sings, the ambition is always audible, and so is the gap between the ambition and the execution, which is usually framed as a gap between what he believes about himself and what he actually is. But occasionally, in the best of these moments, the gap narrows, and something true comes through. The show was always most honest about Brian when it was letting him express something through music rather than through the defensive cleverness of his ordinary speech. The original musical numbers that the show produced, particularly in the earlier seasons, demonstrate a level of craft that the format's reputation for cynicism might not lead you to expect. The songs are constructed with care. The arrangements support the emotional content. The lyrics earn the rhymes they land on rather than forcing them. This quality of musical craft was not accidental. It reflected the genuine commitment of the people, making it to the idea that if you are going to do a musical number in an animated comedy, you should do it well enough that the music does what music is supposed to do. The later seasons maintained this commitment more consistently than they maintained some other commitments. The music remained relatively strong even when the writing around it had become more formulaic. This may be because music resists the kind of shortcutting that written comedy allows. You cannot fake a good melody. You cannot coast on a musical arrangement. The song either works or it does not, and the effort required to make it work tends to be constant, regardless of what the surrounding material is doing. This consistency across the seasons is itself something worth noting. Family Guy's relationship with music represented something durable in the show's identity, a commitment to a specific kind of craft that survived the various pressures that eroded other aspects of the show's quality. It was where the show remembered, even when it had forgotten other things, that it was trying to make something real. Section 17. The political timeline and how it shaped the show. Family Guy premiered in 1999, was canceled in 2002, was revived in 2005, and has been producing new episodes continuously since then. That timeline corresponds almost exactly to one of the most turbulent periods in American political history, and the correspondence is not coincidental. The show that came back in 2005 was a different show in important ways from the show that had been canceled in 2002, and one of the important ways was its relationship to the political world. The original run of the show existed in a late Clinton-era cultural context where American politics, while always partisan and often contentious, had not yet taken on the specific character it would acquire after 2001. The revival happened in the middle of a period when American political life had been transformed in ways that were difficult to miss and impossible to ignore, and the show responded to that transformation in the specific way that a comedy built around cultural observation was going to respond. By incorporating it into its material, by addressing it directly in both obvious and oblique ways, by making the political moment a subject as well as a context. Peter Griffin's political evolution across the show's run is a document of the pressures that working-class white male identity experienced across that period. In the early seasons, he was apolitical in the specific way that people who do not think of themselves as political are apolitical, which is to say that his political assumptions were so thoroughly embedded in his worldview that they did not present themselves to him as political positions at all. They were just reality. He was not a political creature because the politics that served his interests were invisible to him as politics rather than simply as the way things were. As the show continued and the political climate changed, Peter's political identity became more explicit and more contested. Episodes that addressed immigration, gun rights, healthcare, and economic anxiety placed Peter in situations where his intuitive political assumptions were tested against reality and usually, in the show's logic, found wanting. The show was liberal in its sympathies, and those sympathies shaped how these confrontations were constructed. But the most interesting episodes were not the ones where Peter's wrong assumptions were simply corrected. They were the ones where the show acknowledged that the assumptions had come from somewhere real, that they were responses to genuine experiences and genuine anxieties, even if the political conclusions Peter drew from those experiences and anxieties were ones the show viewed as mistaken. This distinction matters. A show that simply mocks the political positions of working-class white men without engaging with the substrate of experience that produces those positions is doing a different kind of work than a show that understands where the positions come from and still finds them worth critiquing. Family Guy was, at its best, doing the second kind of work. It was not always at its best. There were episodes that were simply contemptuous, but the baseline of the show's engagement with Peter's political world was more generous and more complex than contempt. The Brian character's explicit liberalism was another dimension of the show's political self-presentation. Brian was the vehicle for the show's more articulate progressive positions, and this worked better when the show was willing to make him complicated and worse when it allowed his positions to be simply correct. Brian as a person is too flawed to be a reliable political oracle. When the show treated his liberal politics as one element of a complicated and compromised person, the political content was more interesting than when it treated them as the one area of his life where his self-assessment could be trusted. The tension between Brian's stated values and his actual behavior, applied to his political beliefs, was always the most honest version of the character's political function. He believed in equality and treated women as props. He believed in environmental responsibility and drove a Prius while drinking excessively. He believed in the dignity of all people and was reliably condescending to anyone he perceived as less educated than himself. The political views were real. So was the gap between them and his behavior. This gap is not an argument against the views. It is an observation about the specific difficulty of living according to your stated values, which is a difficulty that applies to people across the political spectrum and is worth taking seriously rather than deploying as a weapon. Family Guy, across its long political engagement with American life, was making a point that it did not always fully articulate, but that ran underneath the surface of much of its political material. That the political positions people hold are less interesting than the lives those positions emerge from. The jokes were about the politics. The truth underneath the jokes was about the lives. Section 18. The show and its audience across time. There is a particular way that long-running shows accumulate meaning through their relationship with the audience that watches them across years and decades. The person who was 14 years old when Family Guy premiered in 1999 is now in their late 30s. The person who discovered it during the Adult Swim reruns in 2003 and 2004 and was instrumental in generating the demand for its revival is now, depending on when they started watching, somewhere between their mid-30s and mid-40s. These are not teenagers anymore. They are adults with adult lives and adult perspectives on the world that the show was depicting, and their relationship to the material has changed in ways that have nothing to do with whether the material itself has changed. The experience of rewatching Family Guy as an adult, when you first watched it as a teenager, is a specific kind of cultural experience that the show's particular combination of surface comedy and embedded social observation makes especially legible. When you were 14, Peter's relationship with his job was funny because the workplace was an abstraction to you. The comedy of the put-upon employee with an oblivious and arbitrary boss was available to you in the general sense that you understood the power dynamics involved, but not in the specific sense of having lived inside them. When you re-watch those same scenes at 35, having been inside a workplace for 15 years, having had bosses who were oblivious and arbitrary in exactly the ways the show depicted, the comedy is still there, but something has joined it. A recognition, a specific quality of being seen. This accumulating resonance is one of the things that makes the show worth returning to. The material is fixed, but you are not fixed. And each time you return to it, you bring a different version of yourself, a version that has more of the experience the show was always depicting, and therefore more access to what it was actually saying underneath the comedy. The jokes were always the surface. The truth was always the destination, but reaching the destination required having traveled enough of the road that the destination was recognizable when you arrived. The audience for Family Guy has also changed demographically across the show's run in ways that have affected how the show understood itself and its responsibilities. The early audience was predominantly white, male, and young. The audience that sustains it now is more diverse in ways that matter for how certain kinds of comedy land. Material that would have been processed primarily as boundary-pushing transgression by an audience that did not belong to the groups being targeted lands differently, when members of those groups are in the audience, not as objects of comedy, but as viewers who get to decide whether the comedy is at their expense or whether it is doing something more nuanced. The show's response to this shift was uneven. There were moments of genuine recalibration, places where the humor changed in ways that reflected a more careful consideration of who was in the room and what they might experience the comedy as doing. There were also moments of resistance, of deliberate insistence on the right to make the same jokes regardless of the audience's evolving composition. The debates about this, within the show's own discourse and within the broader cultural conversation about comedy and representation, were productive in some ways and unproductive in others. But the fact that the debate was happening at all reflected something real about the show's relationship with the world it was depicting and the people who lived in that world. The audience that watches Family Guy in 2026 is watching it with an accumulated cultural history that the show's early creators could not have anticipated. They are watching it against the background of everything that has happened in American life since 1999. They are watching it as people who have grown up alongside the show, who have watched it change and who have changed themselves, who bring a quarter century of context to material that was produced over a quarter century of change. The relationship between the show and its long-term audience is among the most complex and most interesting aspects of what Family Guy is and what it has meant. It is a relationship between a cultural artifact and the people who have lived with it through time, and like all long relationships, it has accumulated layers and textures and complications that make it something richer than what it was at the beginning. Section 19. What the silence says. There is a dimension of Family Guy's social observation that works not through what it depicts, but through what it does not depict, through the gaps and silences in its representation of American life that are themselves a form of truth-telling. The show depicts a world that is predominantly white in a way that reflects the actual demographic realities of a certain kind of American suburb in a certain period, but also in a way that encodes certain assumptions about whose experience is the default experience and whose is the exception. The Cleveland character was the show's most sustained engagement with the experience of Black Americans in this world, and the limitations of that engagement, the moments when the representation was too shallow or too dependent on type, were visible alongside its better moments. When Cleveland was spun off into his own show, the space he had occupied in the original cast was not filled with another character of similar complexity. The show did not replace what he had represented. It simply continued without it. The economic world of Quahog is depicted with a specificity that occasionally breaks down into inconsistency. Peter's income, his lifestyle, and his ability to sustain that lifestyle in a modest house in a Rhode Island suburb required a set of financial assumptions that the show sometimes honored and sometimes ignored when a particular story required otherwise. This inconsistency is common to American sitcoms and does not by itself tell us much. But the specific financial anxieties that the show did consistently depict, the fear of job loss, the weight of expenses that seemed always just at the edge of manageable, the gap between what a working-class income could theoretically provide and what it actually provided given the costs of American life. These were specific observations that the show returned to because they were specific truths about the world a lot of its audience actually lived in. The absence of certain characters, of certain types, in certain situations, was a form of commentary on what American storytelling considers default and what it considers exception. The show sometimes pushed against these defaults in the ways its best episodes pushed against the comfortable assumptions of American family comedy, but it also sometimes reproduced them in the ways that any long-running show with a fixed cast and a fixed format tends to reproduce the assumptions embedded in the structure it has inherited. What the silences in Family Guy most consistently point toward is the gap between the official American story and the actual American experience. The official story says that working hard leads to economic security. The show's silences around the mechanisms of economic precarity, the way financial catastrophe can arrive without warning from a medical bill or a job loss or a policy change that the people it affects had no voice in making, suggest an understanding that the official story is less reliable than it presents itself as being. In this respect, the silences are doing similar work to the jokes. The jokes exaggerate the visible until it becomes legible. The silences let the invisible remain invisible while still letting you feel its presence at the edge of what is shown. Both are forms of honesty about a world that is more complicated than the surfaces it presents, a world where the most important things are often not the ones being loudly announced, but the ones being quietly lived. This is what the show was always about, at its core, underneath everything, the quietly lived life. The family in the house on the suburban street that looks like any other house on any other street, where the largest and most significant things that happen without any announcement, in the ordinary transactions of domestic existence that constitute the actual texture of most people's actual lives. The jokes were bright and loud and often outrageous. The truth they were carrying was quieter. It was there in the house when the laughter faded. It is still there, all these years later, patient and specific and real. That is what made it worth watching. That is what makes it worth returning to. Sleep well. Script complete. A note on what we laughed at. Looking back across everything this script has explored, one observation keeps returning. The things Americans chose to laugh at in Family Guy were not random. Audiences do not sustain a show for 25 years by accident. They sustain it because something in it keeps meeting them where they are, keeps offering them something they need, keeps giving form to experiences and anxieties and recognitions that might otherwise remain shapeless. Family Guy offered a specific kind of relief. Not the relief of having your problems solved, because the show was never in the business of solving anything. The relief of having your problems seen, of watching a family navigate the exact texture of pressures you were also navigating, and finding in the navigation something that, viewed from the outside and presented as comedy, had the quality of shared experience. You were not alone in your particular version of the working-class suburban American life. Here were other people in it, exaggerated and ridiculous and recognizable, stumbling through it in ways that you could laugh at because they were also ways you had stumbled through it yourself. This is what the best American comedy has always done, from the beginning of the tradition. It has taken the specific texture of specific lives and found in that texture the universal thing, the human thing, the thing that crosses every line of difference and says, yes, I know, I have been there. I recognize this. Family Guy did this imperfectly, inconsistently, sometimes poorly, and sometimes brilliantly. The brilliant moments were brilliant in the specific way that any true observation of human experience is brilliant. Not because they showed us something new, but because they showed us clearly something we had always known but never quite seen before. The jokes were the vehicle. The truth was the destination. The laughter was the proof that we had arrived. Sleep well, and know that whatever brought you to this video tonight, whatever the shape of the life you are living, there is a reasonable chance that somewhere in the 25 years of a flawed and brilliant and American show, a version of it was seen, understood, and turned, quietly and imperfectly, into comedy. That is no small thing. Good night.